So sorry about that. We're just using a different URL for. We can see the slides. We're just going to give one more minute. Sorry about the delay.
So we got some great tunes. All right, we good to go, Dan?
We are good to go. Sorry about that little delay with the URL. Continue on, John.
No worries. Awesome. So glad to have everyone here. Welcome to Complexity Weekend, all virtual online COVID edition. That was some awesome music we were listening to kind of on the intro by Michael Garfield. Look at the bottom right. You can see where all of his music is. He does art, is a complexity thinker in his own right. Just really appreciate the music he created for this whole event. And we'll be listening to more of it, getting inspired throughout the whole weekend. Let me just get into it. Let's see. So let's start. Everyone who's watching right now, the live stream, We want to see you and hear you in the Keybase. So we have a Keybase team, complexweekend.may2020, and everyone's probably been in already, starting to interact. What I want to do is just ask a couple of questions and then get people to respond in #general in the general chat. That's going to be our live stream kind of chatter box, right? And I want to hear your answers to some questions. And the key thing that I want you guys to think about when you're seeing everyone's responses right now is actually in Keybase, you can see when there's a message, if you hit the ... on the right and hit reply privately, you can immediately start conversations with anyone that draws your attention for any of their answers to these questions. So this would be a great way just to start connecting, because ultimately we all want to find really cool teams to work on and really important, impactful projects to do over the weekend. So the first question, I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds to do this. Okay, so start writing in general. What are you most looking forward to this weekend? Yeah, 30 seconds. You having fun yet? Nice. And definitely hit up #tech support if you're having any issues during this icebreaker. We want to catch them early. Any issues with Keybase, we're going to talk about Jitsi, the video sharing we're going to do during the conference. Talk about Online Town or virtual water cooler. We're going to talk about all that. Any issues right now, #tech support. All right. Hit up general with any of your what you're most looking forward to this weekend. And now I have another prompt for you, and I'm going to give you a minute for this one. Right? This is going to be kind of a deeper one. What question would you like to address during this weekend? So think about it for a minute, write it down, and really you can just you can hit the ... and hit reply privately. And if anyone's question really draws you, just start a conversation now. That can evolve throughout the weekend into something. It could evolve into nothing, but it just doesn't hurt. Just to say, hi, I liked your answer to your question. It's a good way to start. In general, #general will always be our chatter box for these live streams. So I'll give you another 30 seconds. Oh, yeah, here we go. Very good questions. See if I can even peek. Nice. All right, so if you're also watching this live stream after the fact, just go ahead and immediately post to general as soon as you watch it. Just keep that thread going. What questions you want to work on, right? In the previous prompt, what are you most looking forward to this weekend? So that general is going to be our chatter box for all the live streams. So when you're watching any great talks, just anything brought to mind, post it there. You can always privately message people. And there's a lot going on in Keybase. You might have already been exploring it. It's going to be our kind of text, our team text chat and our file sharing service for all the teams that emerge out of this weekend. And some key things we really want you to think about is if you actually click the gear to the right of the team name, there's a browse all channels indicator. If you click that, it'll show you all these hashtags that have been spawned. And we'll go into what all of them are, but the explore ones are really the ones to focus on now, and grab the ones that interest you, because that's where people are going to be talking about topics that interest you. You might find potential teammates. And there's also requests. So requests down here, if you write to request, you can ask any request, right? And someone will try to pick it up. But especially if you want new explore channels, that's where you go. Just let us know. We'll create new ones. They're opt-in. We'll create as many as there's interest for. Now, Jitsi we haven't used yet. We will later on this weekend. This is our video conferencing. When we do breakout rooms, all that kind of fun stuff. And the main takeaway I want you to think about for this right now is basically when you're in Jitsi, you can either hit the gallery view and just double click your video and rename yourself there, or the ... in the bottom right. You go to settings and you go to profile and you write, the convention we're using is your first name and then parentheses your Keybase username, because we basically want the Keybase username to be tied to any activity you're doing, so people always know where to find you, to connect with you, get on a team with you, work on some cool project together. And similarly, we're going to be using this tool called Online Town. Some of you already hopped in before the event. It was fun. You're just this fun little avatar, and you can have video conferencing with anyone near you. And so it's just a fun mixer. We're going to jump into that right after the keynote today. And it's the same convention. If you can, rename yourself first name and in parentheses your Keybase username. So that'll be our virtual water cooler. Now, really quickly at a glance, I'll post these slides into Keybase after, so we don't need to go into too much right now. But basically, there's all these different channels, right? There's introduction, say hi to everyone. You have I need a team we're going to use during the team formation process. Ask the facilitators is a great one. That's one where anything comes to mind that you want to ask any of our 21 facilitators, a lot of great, amazing minds. Just ask it there. Someone will pick it up, and we'll come to some sort of resolution on it. Now, I wanted to just speak for a second about who we are, because we asked everyone to register with some questions when they basically showed interest in coming to the conference. So we actually had 150 people, roughly, who verbally committed. I can be there all weekend. I'm excited. Let's do this. And 21 facilitators. So that's kind of the scope of who we are. And actually, when I crunched the numbers on our responses, 37% were actually beginners to complexity. So there's almost a third are brand new to complexity, which also means 2/3 are experiencing complexity. So that's just exciting to just mix that. And everyone's here to learn a little bit about complexity and to solve some problem that's impactful. And just some other stats real quick. This is a word map just of every location that people put in to the registration. You can see a lot of California, US, but it's a global audience. Germany, Ukraine, right? Tokyo, Spain, some states like Massachusetts, Portugal, Sweden, India. It's all over the map. And I think that's going to create some really amazing teams, a lot of diverse perspectives that are going to help us get to really great solutions to some of these issues we're going to try to tackle. They're very deep issues exposed by this pandemic. And another thing to think about here with the tags that people associate with themselves, there's a lot of academics and students and data scientists, right? But we have 10% government, nonprofit. It's all over the map. But given that we skew a little bit toward academia, I really want people thinking, how can we take the insights in complexity science in academia right now and translate them into real world practice? That's kind of a key question we want to address. And really quickly, the response to what skills, ideas, and perspectives do you feel you can bring to the table is this word map that got formed, where lots of people put in things like Python or research or systems or data or development, theory, social, leadership, ecology, design. These are all these things. You can look at these slides after, but this is just kind of what everyone's bringing to the table. These are what your teams can be made of and what great stuff we could do together. I'll go over this in one of the multiple welcome decks more, but there's 21 amazing facilitators for Complexity Weekend. If you go to the program, you can see a whole slide or a whole sheet dedicated to the facilitators with their Keybase names, everything. And in general, they're going to be helping with complexity thinking, team formation, mentorship during the whole weekend, and really guiding your project if you'd like it. And what we really want to stress here is to be proactive and really reach out directly on Keybase if you want help from anyone. You have all their background information, just whoever you think could really help, go for it. The program I mentioned is actually pinned to the general chat in Keybase. And if you really like, you have this bit.ly as well that I'll post all throughout. So it's this spreadsheet that's kind of our single source of truth for the conference. It's got the scheduling, it's got the links to go to at any moment in time. It's got who all the facilitators are, who all the participants are. And there's a call to action here is if you actually go to the participant info, feel free to fill out a row with any information about yourself that people can learn about you and add you to the team and all that great stuff. And at that, I'm actually going to transition to JP, who's one of the co-organizers. He is a complexity educator and a community organizer and has been very active in the complexity community for years and years. And so I'm very happy to have worked on this with him and Dan and to pass it to him now.
All right, thanks, Sean. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So I've got the interesting honor of trying to answer this question of what is complexity science. And truth of the matter is we'll get there. If you're here, you're already there. Let me put it that way. If you're interested in complexity science, to me, that's kind of the best first pass we can get. Complexity science is what complexity science people do. And we'll get to a lot more nuance as we come along. But another good way to look at this is, looking for simple rules that can give rise to the diversity of structure around us. So to that effect, I've thought of some guidelines for us as a community to kind of structure ourselves around. So these are just our simple rules leading to our complex behavior that we'll all be exhibiting during this program. First one is participate. This is really your weekend, your complex systems conference, your virtual space to explore and really be active in the community, be active in in the complexity space. To that effect, complexity is a scientific paradigm, if you will, that's about exploration and adventure. A lot of traditional science is about hypothesis testing and kind of atomizing things. Complexity really, really flourishes well when we are approaching things with an explorative mindset. So exploration, adventure, play. We also have a very, very large and diverse audience, large and diverse participant group. So be curious, seek the truth of things, and also a lot of one of the cornerstones of complexity is it's kind of cross-disciplinary. We're moving to transdisciplinary. So we have our disciplinary boundaries that we traditionally are trained into, and part of the MO of complexity, if you will, is kind of disregard boundaries and seek the real answers. One of the cornerstone concepts that I like to work with is complexity is the language of analogy. So I think if we keep that in mind, we can get pretty far. And to that effect, not one of us is a real expert in complexity, in complex systems. We all kind of do complexity, but again, if you start to poke at it, it's kind of like a fractal structure, it just goes down forever. So, complexity it's a constant state of learning, constant state of becoming. And just when you think you have things, you learn so much more and your world becomes exponentially larger. So, and a way we get through that, or to that is, everybody is an expert in their own way. Everyone has something to contribute. So when we have our diverse groups, keep that in mind. Everybody's coming at this from their own experience. We like to say that disciplines are just perspectives, so keep that in mind. So there's a space for everyone. To that effect, we're going with Vegas rules, if you will, for this conference. What happens here stays here, unless you're given permission to share. Like if you're working on something with a couple of partners and things fall apart, let them know what's going on in the future. Another important thing, we do have a lot of experts as participants here. So speak to stakeholders. We don't want four physicists making assumptions about sociology without actually talking to a sociologist, because remember, we're all experts in our own way. So that's an important part of what we do, and an important part of cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary complexity research is to actually bring in diverse perspectives and see how it updates and informs your models that you'll be making. And to that effect, that is because we, as Complexity Weekend, we are a complex system. We are a complex adaptive system. We are constantly learning, constantly getting new information, and constantly have feedback placed in. So these are some of the core concepts. Couple of other things. This is just for basic housekeeping duties. These are what we'll call community guidelines. While we're working in our groups and while we're participating in this conference, keep your video on. And because we're in this interesting space, mute when you're not talking, or else it'll lead to feedback loops and things like that that will blow out speakers. We don't want that. We have a convention. If you scroll over some names, we have a convention in Jitsi to update it to basically your name and then in parentheses at your Keybase username. And that's to keep people on track between your live in-person Jitsi face and then your Keybase backend. So we'll be working with that. And then on Keybase, it's also nice to cross-reference with your face on Jitsi, which is a really important part of our social space. So add your real name, short bio on Keybase if you feel comfortable doing that. Another important thing to keep in mind is we do have an international crowd. So for many of us, English is not our first language. So use clear language. Be wary of jargon. If you're using acronyms and everyone doesn't understand the acronym, that's on you. So if any acronyms come up, feel free to question what the acronym is, because we all are coming at this from very diverse backgrounds. Again, be respectful, patient, and be kind. What is obvious in some fields is, or a foundational text in some fields, other people may not have read that at all. So, you know, don't make too many assumptions about what collective knowledge is. Make sure everyone's on the same page. And I think lastly, encourage co-ownership of things. And this includes you all participating in Complexity Weekend. We are co-owners of Complexity Weekend Long Knowledge. So in your groups, you know, everyone has a voice to contribute, and everyone has a piece of ownership to make as well. So some of the other things in you know, complex systems, we can analyze them as goal-oriented behavior. So here's a couple of things to direct our behavior. We're going to be learning complexity as a community of practice. And that's an interesting phrase because it's very much, as I said before, nobody's an expert, and basically complexity is a way of doing things. So we'll all be experiencing that. Everybody should find a team by the end of this and walk away feeling valued and respected. And also, at the end of the day, let's make new friends and find people you want to work with going forward from this, and keep Complexity Weekend as a living entity going forward. So one thing to do now, post a personal goal to #general and let us know who you are. And again, because this is a COVID-19 hackathon, we can pretty much rise to meet this historic moment together. So thanks very much. With that, I'll pass it on to our MC for the evening, Dr. Daniel Friedman. So,
thank you, JP. Thank you, Sean. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Complexity Weekend. And also, if it wasn't clear, thanks for bearing with our experimental use of several free and open source platforms. We're really trying something out we're excited for. And so let's just get right into the speakers. Our first speaker tonight is going to be Sean Griffin. Sean is a CEO at Disaster Tech. He's an expert on decision science, on incident management, and on data science and other topics. So Sean, take it away, share your screen, and let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, my video and audio will be off, and we're really looking forward to your talk. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. Going to share my screen.
JP, unshare.
So I assume you can see my screen at this point.
Looks good. Continue.
Wonderful. So my name is Sean Griffin. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Disaster Tech. And this tweet that I'm showing, I was on the ground in Abaco after Hurricane Dorian last September. And I was with some folks from Soul Relief and World Hope and Team Rubicon. And we were donating and delivering water desalination units after Hurricane Dorian completely obliterated all of Abaco. And here's a video from on the ground that I took.
Were you here when?
And this is a side view. What a lot of folks saw from above, and this was reported in the New York Times, it's the exact same spot. Absolute devastation in Abaco. Very sad. Very devastating, and many people's lives have lost as a result of the hurricane. Another hurricane that most folks know about, and by the way, we're about a week away from hurricane season, June 1st. You know, this is hurricane, just before Hurricane Maria in 2017. This is VIIRS, which is a infrared satellite detection, detects light and heat. From NASA, and you can see lots of light in what you're showing here is Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, St. Croix. And after the fact, Maria, you can see a lot of light is gone. But what's interesting, you see a lot of this light still in San Juan, because the fact is folks in Puerto Rico aren't immune or not new to hurricanes. This is part of their history, part of their culture. Hurricanes happen all the time. So all this light that you're seeing in San Juan is actually the fact that they have backup generators and the ability to have light. What you're seeing here is a model that was provided from the Argonne National Labs, and this was provided in a PDF, which was given to us at the Department of Energy, an estimation of customer outages across Puerto Rico prior to landfall in Hurricane Maria. And you'll notice that on the left, they've predicted, or based on the wind field models, predicted, about 20 to 60% of outages. But as we know, the entire island was 100% without power. So this was, an underestimated model. But as like the saying goes, all models are useful. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. And with this type of model, it allows us to predict potential outages, but it's not a perfect picture of reality. Here I am at the Department of Energy during Hurricane Irma and Maria with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Western Area Power Administration. One of the things I think folks know less about is the fact that the Department of Energy is actually the largest transmission operator in the United States. And when I say transmission, I'm talking about power. So the Western Area Power Administration, Bonneville Power Administration, we actually operate much of the West's infrastructure. So what's interesting here is that WAPA, who provides mostly transmission assets, were actually first in during the Virgin Islands after Hurricane Irma. We sent crews, trucks, and equipment down to the Virgin Islands to be able to deal with the restoration efforts because all the islands were out 100%. Here's another image. And the reason why I bring this up is because during Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, there was a large demand from the power industry to fly bucket trucks like this one from Southern California, Edison, on Air Force craft. And what set this precedent, this photo was actually from Hurricane Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy, we're talking about complexity. What was complex at the time? Well, it was the end of October, and in a couple of weeks was the election. And what we were told, I was at Defense Logistics Agency at the time, short of illegal, make it happen. Because the political imperative was to win an election. And so the United States government did everything it could in its power, no pun intended, to get bucket trucks and crews on military aircraft to New York and New Jersey. But the problem with that decision is that by the time we deployed and mobilized and sent all of these assets to New York and New Jersey, by that time, most of the transmission infrastructure had been restored. So the equipment that was sent was actually kind of useless, although we redirected to New Jersey because they did have some issues with transmission infrastructure restoration. But the fact is we had very little visibility into supply chain, what was needed as it relates to transmission and distribution restoration. Now, in Hurricane Irma, they wanted the same thing. And when I say they, the industry wanted bucket trucks on planes, moving down to the Virgin Islands, moving down to San Juan and to Puerto Rico to restore power. And when we did the analysis, as you can see, when we fly those types of bucket trucks, now granted, we can get maybe about 2 to 4 trucks on an airframe, right? A Department of Defense airframe, which cost $1 million one way. Now, if we did the same air and sea, we take the asset down to Florida and then move it on a barge, it's still about close to $1 million, about $800,000. Now, if I move the truck via land to sea on a Crowley barge from Florida to the end state, which is Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, it costs about $54,000. So the difference between sending 50 to 60 trucks on a barge versus 4 to 5 trucks, maybe 3 trucks on a DoD airframe, $1 million versus $54,000. That's very significant. But the complexity at the time was we have political imperative. Now it's different than when President Obama was going through re-election, but you have a new president in President Trump. It's 2017, never having to deal with a catastrophic season of hurricanes. There's a lot of pressure to move assets and release and relax regulation to move this. But the difference between 1 million and 54,000 is very dynamic. And you can also see that the difference in time is about the same. For us to spend $54,000 to get about 40 to 50 to 60 crews down to the Virgin Islands or down to Puerto Rico in the same amount of time is, about 20 times the amount of money that it took. But there was a lot of political pressure to do so. And if you look at the concept of power outages, why was there additional pressure to push crews and trucks and everything down to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico? Well, the narrative was power. We're talking about the electrification of everything. As more devices come online, Internet of everything, Internet of things, electricity is more dependent than ever. It's actually surprising in COVID-19, the fact that the power grid has survived and has been as resilient as it is. We wouldn't be talking in such a distributed manner over Jitsi without the power grid. It's just impossible. And without the power grid, you don't have communications, you don't have heat, you don't have cooling, you don't have medical equipment online. Without medical equipment, without heat, you can't occupy buildings. So the fact of the matter is, power and power restoration is so important coming out of disasters, right? So we're making the argument to send crews. We might want to spend the money. We might want to spend $1 million to fly bucket trucks from New York or New Jersey or Florida or from Texas down to the Virgin Islands. But we have to look at this as a system, right? So what this diagram outlays is the various first, second, third, and fourth and fifth order effects of the loss of power, potential loss of power on other interdependent systems. In 1998, President Clinton put together a presidential directive about critical infrastructure. And the focus at the time was really about infrastructure sectors sharing information. That's since matured into Presidential Policy Directive 21, Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience. We have 16 sectors and subsectors. And one of the key outcomes from that is that in the current administration, there's been this focus on power, financial, and communication sectors because of the interdependent nature of each of those sectors on one another, right? Because without power, it's impossible to communicate. Without communication systems, it's impossible to have a modern banking system where the banking system relies on an infrastructure. And what we have not been able to do to date is be able to model these types of interdependencies. And when impacts happen, whether it's COVID, as it relates to supply chain effects, or in a physical cyber attack on physical infrastructure, and there are many adversaries against the United States who are interested and who have attempted to conduct advanced persistent threats against our cyber infrastructure in the United States, and particularly on infrastructure systems. If we lose these systems, it's very difficult to understand because we haven't done the due diligence and the modeling to really understand what our interdependencies are in these types of complex events. You look at what's happened in most recent years, not just in a cyber attack or a physical attack or something adversarial, but fire and wildfire risk in Butte County, for example. Pacific Gas and Electric have put out these public maps, what you're seeing here. This is directly from PG&E's website. They're demonstrating this to the public on what the wildfire risk is. Now, me, who's a professional, I even struggle to understand, if this orange area, which is very difficult to discern from a color palette perspective, what is actually going to be out. And the dark areas are to convey that power, if they shut the power off, will be out in the orange areas versus everything being on. But I think it's been clear to those who have experienced those public safety shutoffs in California that it's been very difficult to understand what the risks are and within their communities. And as I conveyed in the previous slide, that the complexity of turning power off, the state was very unprepared back in December and November when they were doing those public safety shutoffs for the first time. What would be the cascading effects of the loss of power on things like water systems, on healthcare systems, on gas infrastructure? The state, and no state, it's no knock on California specifically, but the fact is California and other states just have not been ready for these types of interdependent, complex system cascading effects that they just weren't prepared for. A gentleman who's on our team, Dr. David Wild, he's a professor at the University of Indiana. He talks about why data science can be so helpful to help California's battle future wildfires. And in the context of system complexity, right, one of the things that data science and high performance computing can help resolve is trying to understand where the system interdependence lies. Just doing basic nodal analysis, like the arm bones connected to the elbow and so forth. Basic nodal analysis. If I know that fire is going to affect these infrastructure assets, whether it's power or water or what have you, then I can start to map up downstream what are the cascading effects and how that would impact other systems and how that exposes risk to people in California or any state, not just relative to California. I can do this drill whether it's a hurricane in the southeast, whether it's a snowstorm in the northeast, or whether it's a chemical explosion in Texas. Either way, when you have a hazard that creates risk to one system, what we fail as a community, both industry, as citizens, and government, to really understand is how those effects of a hazard create consequences and cascading risks to other systems that only make the consequence of that single hazard more complex over time. And of course, that only complicates the restoration and ultimately the recovery, which can have much more systemic risk over time. One of the interesting things that FEMA has done to try and grapple with this system interdependency and system level risk is trying to map out various infrastructure sectors in bite-sized areas. So for example, they're using what's called the community lifelines: safety and security, food, water, health and medical, energy, communications, transportation, hazardous materials. And they are trying to map out components and subcomponents of these lifelines to really to understand what are the impacts or the stability, what they're calling infrastructure or lifeline stability of each of these lifelines. Now, what's interesting in COVID-19, the Federal Emergency Management Agency did not map out the impacts of COVID-19 across these lifelines. Well, why not? To be honest with you, I'm scratching my head about that because the whole country has done a lot of work. Folks who've been interested in this type of work on trying to understand what are amongst those 7 lifelines, and it's not perfect because one of the criticisms that I've made, for example, economy has been bucketed under communications, which makes no logical sense. And there's really no articulation about how the hazard affects these lifelines, such as energy and communications and transportation. And this, interestingly, schematic was actually built in an exercise called Crimson Contagion, which was focused on a influenza impact to the United States back in August of 2019. In fact, the United States was preparing for a massive pandemic last summer called Crimson Contagion. That was the name of the exercise. And what's interesting is they built it this schema. And what they tried to do was to figure out what types of data and data elements would lead to essential elements of information to build critical information requirements to understand what is the stability of each lifeline. And we still haven't done this. This was actually very new. It was proposed to me back in the summertime, and I found it very interesting. But we, similar to Hurricane Katrina, the National Response Framework, the National Incident Management System was actually implemented in 2005. And then shortly thereafter, we had Katrina. We didn't have enough time to train and implement and be able to orient people around these types of architectures. And very similarly, FEMA rolled out this lifeline construct without training, getting folks oriented. One of the other things that I really like to do in the emergency management sector is run exercises, because there's all these things called the unknowns, and certain things we do know. We know the fact that the Gulf Coast is going to be threatened by hurricanes. It's a perennial threat. We've already had Tropical Storm Arthur that's happened this year, and we have to be ready. So I had conducted an exercise in May of 2017 to convey to the Houston area. It's been 10 years since Hurricane Ike, which was 2008, and the United States is likely due for a strike in the Gulf and an impact from a hurricane. So what did we do? We did some analysis using data from Duns and Bradstreet at the time to articulate what would be the immediate impact to small and medium-sized businesses from a Hurricane Ike-like strike. And this became very valuable because in Hurricane Harvey that happened months later, we were able to use that data and analysis to prepare and best understand the economic impacts from that storm. The other thing that you need to look at is not just the localized effects, but how an impact locally has systemic risk across the entire system. So one of those impacts would be, for example, the Colonial Pipeline. The Colonial Pipeline serves from Texas and Louisiana all the way up to the East Coast. And if you look at a state like South Carolina, in certain counties in South Carolina, 60 to 70% of their petroleum import, because most states are net importers, most states don't actually refine their own petroleum products into derivative products like ultra low sulfur diesel or gasoline. So many counties are net importers and they rely on this Colonial Pipeline. So when we had flooding in Louisiana and Texas, the compressor stations were flooded out. It took down the pipeline system, and then therefore all of that fuel and refined product was no longer available to those states. Another interesting type of model that we've been trying to understand is how do people evacuate, which is very complex, right? Because not only do you have to deal with the risk factors of the individuals who are potentially impacted from a hurricane, everything from socioeconomic factors to transportation, whether they have access to transportation or not. And what we found is running this model is that it takes a lot of time. So not only is it complex as far as the inputs, but the computational resources that are required to run these types of models are very intense. In the case of this model that we've partnered with Cornell, University of Delaware, UNC Chapel Hill, bringing in meteorology models, hydrology models, coastal inundation models such as ADCIRC, which is advanced circulation, and evacuation shelter models. As you can see, total delay is 60 hours. Now, if I'm a coastal emergency manager, I don't have tolerance or time to wait 60 hours for an answer. So I'm going to use what's best available to me to make a decision. And many coastal emergency managers, as well as inland, have been very much criticized on their ability or their inaction on making a decision on how to evacuate based on its complexity. Because think about the political pressure when you start to make a decision, just like in COVID, making the decision to shut down entire states or metropolitan areas where people can't move about, or in this case, have to leave and relocate to somewhere where they may not have the means or the capabilities to relocate because they don't have the infrastructure or the economic capacity to leave that specific area. So one of the things that we've done as a company, first is that we've decided to co-design with the users because we recognize that situations are very complex and that it requires a community to be able to prepare, respond, and recover for disasters. We really need the users at the table. And one of the reasons why we failed to really understand system complexity is that we failed to bring the users to the table. And, we can't just look at this in a vacuum as some theory, a theoretical exercise. We have to have the people who are at the table who would reduce risk to systems in order to make communities more resilient. In addition, we need to have effective data curation and science at the foundation of everything we do. One of the bottlenecks that we've experienced in COVID-19 everything from bed counts to ICU availability to PPE and so forth. We just don't have access to the data. And even if that data is available, it's poorly curated. And even if we have the data, the models that we apply to that data are not necessarily scientifically evident or scientifically proven. So everything that we do must have proper data curation and science at the foundation. In addition, a lot of the work that we do is very complex. So we have to use the the age-old art of storytelling to be able to convey very complex system to the lowest common denominator and using storytelling to that effect. In addition, we have to be able to surface inequality or inequities as it relates to communicating system risk. Because, in order to understand risk, you have to be risk literate. And so we have to work with communities to increase literacy and risk literacy so that we can be more equitable in our ability to communicate risk and also have a more inclusive seat at the table. I mentioned risk literacy. I won't touch more upon that. And prepare for the unknown. So in order for us to really deal with future risks, whether it's COVID-19 or other complex types of unknown infectious disease or hurricanes or other disasters, we have to be ready to have the data, to have the science, and to have the models to really understand what are we at risk, what are we going to do about it, and what are the right types of investment. Because the World Bank wrote a report last year called Lifelines, and one of the things that they noted, without the right climate data, without the right climate models, it's impossible to be able to understand the types of risk in communities and make the right investments to be able to reduce risk and build resilience around the world. So I thank you for your time.
Greetings. Thank you so much, Sean. Really an important perspective that helps us refocus on the mission critical nature of complexity. These are real world problems that we want to be addressing. And so now we're going to move on to our next speaker. I'll just give them a few minutes to jump on board. So this is going to be Sudebi, Thakurata, and Probal Banerjee. They're two of our complexity colleagues from India. And just to tell a quick story while they're getting logged into this room here, Sean, you can leave this Jitsi if you'd like. These facilitators reached out to us and conveyed their tremendous experience with global hackathons. And for us, the organizers trying to put this all together, it was a lot like putting a puzzle together where we didn't know what the final picture would look like. We also didn't know what all the pieces were or how they'd all fit together. So when people reach out to us and wanted to participate, such as Sudebi and Probal, we knew that this was just an experience that we had to bring to the attendees because it's so important. So there are going to be just a few minutes because we're running slightly different than the stated schedule. But if any of the facilitators wanted to pop in for a minute just while we're waiting for D-Epicenter to jump in. Otherwise, just to give a few thoughts from the chat that were being discussed while we were having that first talk by Sean, there was a few discussions about the differential topology or how things are connected between disaster and peacetime situations. So how do we go from a peacetime organization to a disaster organization? And how do we make sure that just as Sean brought up with the availability of the data, how do we make sure that the people who need to make decisions in the moment have access to the right information? And having access to the right information is the beginning, but there's more to it than just having the right information. There's having the right tools and the right team so that the kind of models that you're creating are integrated with stakeholders and realistic at every stage. So that's the kind of thinking that we're gonna promote. And definitely this following set of talks and the keynote speech will help reinforce that. Another fun thread from the general was related to agent-based modeling, or ABMs. So agent-based models are one of the favorite modeling techniques of complexity. And in an agent-based model, rather than specifying the parameters or the features of the model directly, you just specify what are the agents in the model. whether it's an ant or a neuron or an economic actor. You just specify who are the agents in the model and how do they interact. How do those interactions give rise to collective properties and complex behavior like chaos or feedback loops? And so there were several great discussions about how agent-based modeling and data sets could be integrated. And potentially on a related wavelength, we also were starting to think about a topic that's also crucial for our conference, and that's representation and accessibility and visibility of all kinds of people. It's not just about signing up. We really want everybody to participate actively and know and understand that they're a valued team member. Just one thought that we've been having on that as an organizer set about how everyone plays a role at every single stage of the design process, from the sort of brainstorming and team formation phases to the actual project specification stages to the implementation and carry out. At all of those stages, having everyone's perspective is going to be essential for these projects, because the best person for a team is the person who improves team performance the most. And that doesn't mean the person necessarily who takes the whole project on their shoulder or the person who sees it from the beginning to the end. That means the person who's able to bring the right questions and the right perspectives into play at the right time. And so it really is an important opportunity for every group to be in this special setting where we have so many people with different skill levels and complexity, and also with different backgrounds, with different geospatial locations. We have so many types of diversity that are represented tonight and in this weekend conference. We really hope that you'll be able to take advantage of it and hopefully make some solutions, make some research directions, make some projects that help ameliorate some of these previously missed over perspectives. Let's look back through general and just see if we have any other thoughts before we go to DEPICenter in just a few minutes. There's a great discussion happening about how we can determine the relationship of complexity to disasters. So someone asked, what does a complexity-informed disaster response look like? How many of these principles are general, and how many of the details have to be figured out in the moment? It's something where we don't just want to plan, and then have the plan change in the last minute. It's something where we want to know how much to plan and not overemphasize specific models that might happen, because we might get overly surprised by what reality actually passes us. Here's another question. What analogical lessons could be carried over from innate or adaptive immune system to disaster recovery? And that person provided a few quick thoughts. They said, the innate immune system has a fast response time and it acts locally, whereas the adaptive immune system is slower, but it has a comprehensive effect on the global system. So we can start to think from a complexity science perspective, what does that look like? What is the innate immune system of a region? Is that the local peace officers? Is that the fire department? Is that the Coast Guard? Who are the innate immune system guards who are kind of always ready to spring into action in a generalized way? And who are the adaptive immune system sentinels? Who are the individuals who are a little bit slower to come online in a disaster context, but they're going to be the ones who bring that specialty? We have a few other great comments. We have a lot of fun discussions and emojis. I'm already really looking forward to working with you. I see a lot of just fun, emotional emojis, and I love being able to just click a bunch of emojis for a message as I'm doing right now. It's also really interesting, and this is a point we'll return to later in the weekend when we're working with Jitsi as a platform for video conferencing in small groups. People can look at the speaker stats in Jitsi. So you can look at how many minutes and seconds each speaker was talking for a given video meeting. And it's actually a quantitative way to look into things that were previously only qualitative. You know, we've all had the experience where we walked out of a meeting and thought, wow, this person was really talking for a little bit more than they should have been speaking. And a little bit too often, unfortunately, that lines up with a lot of our implicit bias and all of our education that led up to the current system that we're experiencing. And so using tools like speaker stats, not in an accusative fashion, not in a way where we expect that every single person is going to want to speak for the same exact number of minutes, but just understanding that as a community, we value the transparency and the accountability and the equality that can come about when we have these transparent tools and these ways to see how people are using the tech platforms. We're also having some really fun discussions about the relationship between politics and science. Someone wrote, I am often fearful of political motivations, which could be to silence or misrepresent or provide benefits to any specific members, rather than any specific technical challenge as pertains to the availability of appropriate data and information. It's so true. There's so many questions where the data might already exist, the team might already exist and be latent, and there simply isn't the political will to step up to the plate and ask, how are we going to get this done from a complexity perspective? How are we going to make sure that the right teams form in the right way and that they're absolutely inclusive, and we're not merely virtue signaling, we're not merely doing innovation theater, which is a term that I actually learned from Sudebi and Probal, the speakers who are about to be coming online. This idea that a lot of times the politically expedient thing to do is just to act like you're figuring something creative out, act like you're taking care of it, act like you think about the children all the time, act like you're caring for the old people. But the reality is that we need a holistic way of looking at some of these problems that are facing our whole world. We're simply not going to have a stable governance system if the kinds of lawlessness that are permitted on the public space from a communications angle are enabled. And hopefully complexity science can bring about this tone of reasonable discourse and common sense, while also highlighting the global community of research and a function that we all participate in. Somebody in the chat just wrote, politics and science is complexity science. I have a hard time explaining to scientists how we can connect the complex political decision to our science and model it. It's absolutely something that faces everyone is, okay, we've made a very interesting model, we've made a heuristic, or we've made a simplification of the system, but how are we going to actually, within our current governance structures, come to the policies that are going to help people out in a really equitable way? Those are the kinds of big questions that we want to address during this weekend. We want you to form affinity groups with people through the sub-channels. So to join the sub-channels, you'll just go to the gear to the right of complexweekend.May 2020, click the gear next to that team name and browse all channels, and just opt in to all the channels that you're curious about. And so you'll always be able to find people who are discussing similar topics to you, who just want to learn about similar topics to you. And in just one moment, we're going to have the Epicenter Consulting join, which is Sudebi and Probal, just to give them a brief introduction. So as soon as that they jump in, they can immediately begin talking. Sudebi is an expert in research, complex systems, welcome the Epicenter, and design-led innovation. Probal is an expert in design-led innovation and transformative and emergent leadership. I'm going to turn it right over to you two. I'm going to disable my video, so screen share and then enable your video if you'd like. And thank you so much for for bearing with me during that interval. Looking forward to you guys' talk. Looks great. Looks great. We can't hear you, but continue with your talk. It looks great with the slides, the Epicenter.
Okay. Can you hear us now?
We can hear you. All good to go. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thanks, man.
Okay. All right. So should we start?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sudebi, and this is Probal. And with many years of our experience of working across people, across the globe with many people, we would like to share our perspectives and insights around what we called as the art, practice, and complexity of systemic, creative, and transformative collaborations.
Sorry, just an issue with the window.
So during all the different challenges our times have thrown at us, sorry, I don't know why this is not being shown.
So the screen went dark. Now it's back to your video. So just click screen share again, and then just go back to how it was. But we could see it great.
Okay. One minute.
This is called technical complexity. For
Absolutely.
Can you see the screen now, Daniel?
Not yet.
So
whether you have to just reload the tab and then click the share your screen on the very bottom left.
Sure.
Okay, now we can see it, make it full screen, and then we'll be good to go.
Sure.
Perfect, continue.
All right. So yeah, as I was saying that this is Sudebi and here is Probal. And with many years of our experiences, we would like to share our perspectives and insights around what we call the art, practice, and complexity of systemic, creative, and transformative collaborations. During all the different challenges of our times have thrown at us, it also has offered a unique possibility. And the possibility is to be a cosmopolitan local. And a cosmopolitan local is one who has the skills of experiencing, mapping, and crafting futures together through the power of imagination that turns every constraint into a possibility that can be designed and redesigned. And it also offers us the possibility to recognize the potential of collective action. One needs to hone the ability to choose, to be intentional about one's impact, and place the intentionality in the intersections of many aspects, which might also lead to unintended consequences. An immersive process into various contexts eventually enables one to critically evaluate their prior knowledge, interconnect seemingly disjointed parts to create a holistic overview, generate insights, and identify actionable concepts. This process enables whoever is in collaboration, this process enables them to collaboratively discover the different barriers and constraints towards materializing opportunities across boundaries with essential future skills. It's almost like how Marcel Proust had said that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And with that quote, we would like to take you through our journey of asking many questions which we believe is a foundation of any collaboration. During this talk, instead of sharing absolute statements, we thought it's probably a good idea if we share some of the questions that either both of us have explored through our work, or these are questions that have popped up through our work. So how can cross-cultural, transnational, systemic creative collaborations be facilitated among people from diverse contexts and disciplines, where interestingly the facilitator is also from a different context as well, much like what's happening now in the Complexity Weekend, where the cross-cultural, transnational nature is not just existent within the teams, but it's also about the facilitators, also about the organizers. And then the question that comes up is what really binds individuals from diverse socio-cultural, geopolitical contexts, and what acts as challenges in an increasingly interconnected world. Because as the world gets more and more interconnected, and without we realizing how interconnected and how interrelated and how interdependent we are, it throws so many challenges and so many possibilities as well.
So, in a hackathon like this and in a lot of other innovation processes around the world, we see that teams are formed, and having led teams for nearly 20 years, I know that getting a group of people into a formal structure does not necessarily mean that you derive the outcome that you need from them. Collaboration is not about or it does not mean just coming together. Similarly, a hackathon does not mean that it's an innovation theater rather than getting something meaningful out of the entire process. Sometimes the process itself becomes more important than the outcome of the process per se. What? So how do seemingly unknown contexts unleash opportunities? Such as completely different people coming together, not only to learn about another's perspective, but also one's own as well, while discovering invisible elements that connect and catalyze creative collaborations. Since we are facilitators, we often face this question: can facilitation act as a bridge between an egocentric, competitive, boxed past and an ecocentric, collaborative, interconnected, regenerative future, bringing seemingly different stakeholders together towards the well-being of both people and the planet in creative and collaborative ways with a heightened sense of purpose?
And we'll spend a little time in understanding what purpose is and why is it such a driving force. Because if anyone engages a little bit with complexity, the ideas of complexity and the ideas of complex systems, we will all know that a systems thinker, and when many systems thinkers come together in a collaboration, there are certain acts that they engage in, certain kinds of immersion that they experience, and there are certain kinds of act of interconnectedness that they collectively engage with. And all of these things are centered around a central purpose, a deep connection with the purpose, and working for a flourishing planet and people sort of guide this entire act. And some of the things that one needs to engage in these kinds of collaborations is to question their own assumptions, to enable the system to see itself while holding the whole picture, working at different levels concurrently, and different levels of time, different levels of space, different levels of multiple contexts, to identify connections and how parts interconnect or interact, engage with different perspectives, sometimes contrasting perspectives as well, understand agency, power, responsibility, work with not just activating forces. We're constantly looking for forces that activate, but we also need to look at resisting forces, and also consider consequences and timescales, understand different patterns to make effective interventions, and very importantly, embrace complexity constantly, learn and adapt through it. So, can collaborations be fostered with an approach of building anew rather than rebuilding the old? Because the moment we will have an affinity to constantly go back to the past and try to rebuild the old when everything is falling apart, we are only going to be having a problem-fixing, troubleshooting approach rather than a more creative approach of imagining something that has not existed. So, can we co-sense our way into a complex future of constant living change?
Speaking of collaborations, can collaborations be truly inclusive? We know that in any team or in any collaborative effort, there are power dynamics which come into play, and some participants seem to be more important than others. There is, to begin with, a trust deficit which needs to be overcome. Can collaboration also be dealt with from a perspective of psychological safety, and can we be truly fearless in collaborations? Can collaborations be healing? Can they be regenerative? Can they be emergent? Are the questions that we would often ask. How can the journey of collaboration be transformative in nature? And does it transform both the inside and the outside? So it is not just the outcome that we are trying to seek, but does it transform me as a participant, as an individual? Is there a sense of transformation I have after having gone through this process of collaboration? It's very important that we reflect upon that.
Yeah, and that really requires every single member in this process of collaboration to be sensitive, but at the same time be assertive. So how do we gracefully disagree? How do we have authentic conversations? How do we give and receive honest feedback? And how do we try and understand not just problems, but also worldviews, beliefs, behavior, and action? And also acknowledge that there are always multiple interpretations of anything. There needs to be deep listening. There should be informed choices and unheard voices, which need to be heard during an act of collaboration. And hence, collaboration is not a one-time event, which can be started by some energizing games, and then we all think that we're doing something, right? It's a process and it takes practice to do so. Can this practice be defined by the individual's experiential perspectives and lived narratives, shaping who they are rather than their backgrounds limiting them to what they do? Because mostly we are all very used to asking anybody we meet for the first time, hey, what do you do? We don't really want to know who are you, right? So can collaborations be seen as a way of collective shared and yet personal sense making, which is driven by an inquiry towards which the collaborators journey together? Interestingly, the inquiry is never an absolute but keeps getting reframed, making the whole act of collaboration one of a complex adaptive system itself. Can individual uniqueness be retained in collaborations while transcending individual egocentric viewpoints? And this is a point that we have been talking about again and again, that coming together doesn't mean that it becomes a summary of many different things where the individual nuances sort of get lost. It's also not one voice dominating. We can be equal in the humility and wonder of the uncertainty, unpredictability, ambiguity, and novelty of the future, where we can perceive each other to be the same in terms of what we do not know. Hopefully, that will or that can help dissolve the boundaries, boxes, and chains constructed in the past in terms of what we know. So the more we acknowledge and accept that we don't know, the curiosity to know, the curiosity to learn and discover actually help us become more humble.
So can collaborations be both critical and creative in nature? While we try to understand the science and the logic of how to collaborate, can we try to understand and master the art of collaboration? Can collaboration be seen as a mosaic of many subjectivities and an ecosystem, rather than unifying neutrality that dissolves all subjectivities into a uniform singular perspective?
And then comes the point, can we then allow the future to drive and guide us and not the past only? Of course, there is going to be an interesting interplay or a ripside amongst the past, the future, and the present in which the collaboration is taking place. So can we then allow the future to drive and guide us, where the path gets created by walking and navigating a landscape which doesn't have a map? Maybe in that learning journey, we value each other as we discover so much about each other and ourselves as well. Can we visually map this journey as we imagine, envision, unlearn, and relearn, while the visual harvest of this cartographic exercise help us navigate further? And we possibly will end by saying that one of the biggest realizations someone can have is problems are not absolute. Problems are contextual, relative, complex. They're subject to interpretation. What is negative about a problem for someone might be positive for another. So the ability to frame problems contextually and situating the problems in a larger systems are the two most important parts to any process. And this can be done when the starting point is not a hypothesis, or even worse, an assumed problem statement, but an inquiry, a shared inquiry, a collective inquiry towards which everyone walks together. Thank you.
Thank you, Epicenter. That was really awesome. You brought together so many of those themes. If it's okay with you, if we have a minute or two, I'd like to just ask some of these questions from general with you.
Yes.
Someone asked, how is trust formed in collaboration? And on the flip side, how is trust broken?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. Not that there is one answer to it, but I feel like anybody who gets into a collaborative space, if their first identity becomes that they're a learner, as opposed to a performer, I think that kind of melts away a lot of boundaries, which create these kinds of intimidating kind of power dynamics, because the trust is not just about someone else. I think trust is also about ourselves. When we don't trust ourselves, we start getting into this power dynamics or a game of hierarchy, or I mean, a collaboration basically becomes a competition in that case, right?
Yeah, like we were saying, Daniel, moving from an egocentric worldview to an ecocentric worldview. So if you think more about the ecosystem and the team than just yourself, trust becomes, it's not easy, but it probably becomes easier to form trust in such relationships. Yes.
Yeah, and I feel there's one more thing that we have seen in our experience, and I think it only becomes more complex when you're remotely collaborating, is that first of all, language, communication is a very important thing, and words have their own baggage. One is, there are only very few languages, and English is probably one of the top in that, which fortunately or unfortunately divide us and connect us. And it comes with its own colonial baggage. We also need to understand that words are not absolute, they have their own ambiguity. So instead, if you focus on the meaning rather than the words, so not to assume that any word is universal but contextual, and in a group, try and create a shared understanding about communication and language. And also, I feel if rather than trying to constantly talk about what our strengths are, if we can be vulnerable in front of each other, that creates some kind of trust that, well, I know you might have some limitations, so do I, and then it's not a performance again.
Thank you for the answer. You really tied together, I mean, everything from the vulnerability to the ability to form trust in groups and to avoid that innovation theater. One other question from the chat, and also related to the interest of a lot of our participants and facilitators, is what does the visual aspect of complexity look like to you? And how do we use the visual media to reflect complexity and actually develop it, not just as a way to just take a picture of what the scientists are working on, but really to contribute to complexity through visual work?
Absolutely, and I think that's a very important question as well. That in our world, we use the term making thinking visible. I think when we document our process and not document for the sake of either showing somebody, when we document for ourselves so that the process becomes visible to us, when that can happen collectively, so it's more like a visual mapping than just trying to capture one moment and making it a product. But it's the process which is constantly getting mapped, visualized, so that in that visualization, everybody is equal. So it's again not somebody from an outside perspective with an external gaze trying to capture something and trying to claim, well, this is what it looked like. So this co-sensing, co-traveling, co-presencing, and probably, if I may say, co-mapping this entire process is very important. And so visualization is one of the most important things in this mapping exercise, because people are constantly dwelling in between the parts and the whole. When collectively we visualize, which can happen through a visual facilitation kind of a mode, everybody can keep adding to what's already out there rather than trying to create a summary. So it becomes a synthesis of the entire trajectory, and definitely newer findings emerge out of it when you visualize.
Great. Thank you so much, the Epicenter, and we're really looking forward to seeing you tomorrow in our Saturday afternoon session, where you'll be back to help guide us through some of the team brainstormation and formation process. So you can leave this Jitsi, and I'll introduce the next speaker, who's Michael Zargham, PhD, Michael is an expert in systems engineering, data science, economics, governance, blockchain, and a million other things. He's a founder and CEO at Block Science and was also one of our facilitators at last year's Complexity Weekend. So Zargham, thanks so much for speaking. We're really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thanks for having me. I am going to share my screen and turn my video back on, and there we go. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about emerging institutions and computational methods, and I'm going to be talking a lot about complexity science and its relation to what is essentially model-based systems engineering. I'm going to try to keep it focused on sort of social and economic systems and the way we use computational methods. But I also think you could say that this is the obligatory blockchain talk that every conference has to have, although I am not focused predominantly on the technological aspects in terms of implementation. We are going to be talking about the way sort of new internet-based communities are sort of building themselves, and a little bit about what kind of tools and methods are used to support those communities, and a little bit about what kind of methods and tools are used to analyze those communities, including the sort of designs of their interaction patterns. And so for that, I'm going to sort of tie this into our complexity science and thinking about parts, wholes, and properties arising from relationships. And this is kind of part of a broader study of systems theory with a focus on complex social and economic systems that have a sort of technological substrate or a sort of backbone or nervous system made up of information processes. Now, to sort of give a brief summary of the concept here, we're going to imagine that we have some low-level technical capability that's defined in terms of software. These softwares are used to create peer-to-peer networks, which enforce some computational rules. If you have some technical background, you can think of this as a shared virtual machine with some rules about ensuring that all of the participants agree on the state of that virtual machine. But setting aside the technical capabilities and focusing on the sort of social aspects, we can actually look at this in terms of interaction patterns or sort of local governance rules and local behavior in the context of those governance rules and the resulting sort of value flows that occur. And that the purpose of these systems is actually to coordinate individual activity in a manner that allows sort of desirable emergent properties. And there's a really natural tension between the sort of bottom-up sort of agency of the participants and the sort of top-down nature of the rules, and those rules actually providing action sets or things you can do. And I want to sort of highlight this in relation to our collab, our COVID-19 theme by bringing up this example of a particular sort of internet-based community that's emerged to sort of allocate resources in response to the COVID crisis. And this particular organization is one of these internet-based coordination groups. And they use a thing called an Aragon DAO, which is an Ethereum-based smart contract kit that was used to set up a set of local community rules, and it mostly revolves around communicating with each other, collecting funds, voting on proposals, and allocating funds to specific projects. And I've given an example here where in a Telegram channel, there were some proposals and some discussions around personal protective equipment the allocation of funds to sort of fund a project. And there were some discussions, vote, and some funds were actually allocated. And this sort of gives you a feel for what kind of real human activity is happening on top of these kinds of infrastructures. They were largely coordinated by a bunch of individuals who had funds, time, energy, and suggestions, and sort of organized themselves around those decisions. Now, what's interesting here, and is probably most closely related to my ongoing research, is how we understand the sort of computational and the sort of social scientific aspects. And so I've been doing some ongoing research with a handful of collaborators, Primavera de Felipe, Joshua Tan, Jeff Emmett, and we've been kind of trying to distill some definitions around these concepts and tying them back to sort of institutional structures and definitions in the social sciences. I'm not going to read this whole slide to you, but I'm going to make a point here that there's a strong distinction between the rules and the processes and the instantiation of them or the administration of them by code. And the idea that the sort of humans are using this code as a sort of infrastructure or sort of shared nervous system can help lead towards sense-making, decision-making, and sort of community-scale self-actualization that is often not possible in a purely sort of, we'll say, competitive environment, or one where the political aspects are sort of unregulated by some governance process. And sort of recognizing the need for these kinds of coordination processes, but trying to keep those rules simple and enshrining them in code in a manner that allows the code to automate the administration of those processes can actually lead to sort of quick and purposeful outcomes amongst groups, though it can also facilitate politics in an adverse sense. Ideally, it facilitates politics in an effective sense. And we've done some work on the sort of role of technology in governance at the University of Vienna, or the Vienna University of Business and Economics. Is the VU, the translation is German-speaking language. So where we've actually sort of been studying these sort of crypto-economic systems in the context of feedback systems and governance, and sort of in the tradition of cybernetics, looking at the governance or the oversight system as being part of the system. And so you can't sort of separate yourself as the modifier or the sort of governor of the system. You actually have to look at it as part of the system. And that goes for both the human steering and the sort of automated steering that comes with sort of this computational or automated policy creation. And in fact, an important thing to note is that when you automate things, you're often like really opening doors to some complexity that you might not have known before, because humans actually often sort of address certain feedback challenges innately, and they don't necessarily realize that the heuristics that they actually use sort of second order heuristics to adjust for the places where their heuristics don't work. And so if you put those heuristics into code and you don't have the sort of discretionary corrections, you often get unintended consequences or outcomes you didn't expect. In the case of these computational systems, the distinction between sort of the constitution or the rules, rights, processes, the sort of description of the social system and how it could or should work versus the actual software that implements it is a very important distinction. And while I won't go into this, it's actually an aspect of tension in this particular community, as there's a lot of memes around the relationship between code and law, and actually distilling the difference is actually an important aspect of having sort of social systems and technical systems that sort of co-evolve in a healthy way. From the sort of research perspective in complex systems, what we're increasingly seeing is an importance in understanding the relationship between different scales. So the agent level or agent-based models that we talked about earlier, they really focus on the decision-making or the goals at the individual level, and how the individuals' decisions interact with each other to cause emergence or outcome properties at the system level. But when you're designing policies and implementing them, you're changing the set of actions that an agent is allowed to take or can take sort of within the system, and it's sort of changing the sort of system plant in the control theoretic sense, or the sort of policy in the sort of more governance and social system sense. And the idea that you can mutate the policies or the rules and that the agents will be beholden to them creates a sort of link between the agent level behavior and the system level behavior. And we're trying to examine the way this meso perspective allows for a modulation of a system that sort of interacts between the perception of the system level behavior by the agents and the emergent characteristics of that system from the individual agent behaviors. In our field, or my field, we use a lot of different tools from a lot of different environments, and the sort of triangulation that I use is I talk about economics, systems engineering, and complex systems. And it may be that we can think of complex systems as subsuming this work, because a lot of it is complex. But the truth is that the economics field and the systems engineering field both have tools and methods that are maybe distinct from the complexity science methods, and they're not inherently better or worse. They just provide different perspectives. And one of the fundamental tenets here is that since there's no perfect model, there's always a necessity for looking at different models and different perspectives to get a holistic picture of what you're dealing with. And here we look at computational social science, operations research, and cyber physical systems as sort of existing overlapping fields, kind of getting this very transdisciplinary approach. And I'm going to give you a quick sort of overview of some of the things that we do. The first one is economics is not very well defined, but it is clearly covering a particular domain, and that is about the sort of making of decisions, the coordination about making those decisions, and the sort of way in which these things resolve, whether it's at the political economy level or whether it's at the low level microeconomic view. But at the end of the day, we're talking about systems and agents. And this kind of brings me back to my point about sort of the macro and the micro being interconnected through the meso. And ultimately, we want to understand not just how agents interact with each other, but also how the agents interact with the system. And that means that the system is in some ways an agent in its own right, depending on how you think about agent-based modeling. Now is where things get scary. Automation is happening. And I don't mean in the sense of robots taking your job. I literally mean social processes are having algorithms intermediating humans. And this doesn't just mean these emerging institutions. This actually also means AI and its role in recommending which movies you watch, and AI recommending in what products you buy, and just generally intermediating algorithms between humans and other humans, or humans and their decisions, affecting what information they see, which influences their decision making, even if the individual isn't actually changing the way they make decisions. We all know that it's, any information process, the inputs have a big effect on the outputs. And so with this sort of warning automation in progress, we're going to talk a bit more about how the interactions between these algorithms and people and social systems and economic systems are studied using computational methods. So for the first part, we should look at the way system models and sort of individual decisions interrelate. So I tend to think in terms of control theoretic language. So I think of system plants or process models or descriptions of how things work. But you have to understand that these are potentially deterministic, conditioned on non-deterministic inputs. And so even in a model that has a pretty rigorous set of rules about what would happen if someone did something, when we have individuals, humans who are expressing themselves, we can't say a priori what they should do. We want them to express what they want to do. And their actions, in fact, they provide information to the system. Too often in a lot of models, we see these discussions about rationality and what someone should do. And a big part of opening this up into a social science frame is to say there's not a should do, there's did, and maybe an interpretation of what information that doing provided to the system. And this is interesting both at the individual agent level and at the sort of emergent dynamics of the system. Again, often non-obvious. But this requires combining both observed data and systems theory into the same mental frame and the same methodology. So in our work, we use a lot of robotics and automation, but a lot of very applied math heavy work. So configuration spaces are sort of representations of the shapes or forms the system can take. And I like to use the robotic arm example because it's very clear that although you could think of the arm as a bunch of points in three-dimensional space, there's real limitations about how it can move, and its properties are actually properties of the shape of the space, of the ways the arm can be, even if that's not every possible combination of say 3 or 4 points in three-dimensional space. And this gets really interesting when many agents are involved, because now we can imagine that instead of me controlling the robotic arm with this little remote, all of us are. But if we're all controlling the same robotic arm, it's going to flail around quite a bit. And so any safety properties or any characteristics that we want to always be true aren't actually properties of the individual decisions. They're properties of the sort of mathematical space that represents the set of configurations the arm can be in. And as silly as this analogy might seem, it's actually the case that in medical robotics, there are even cases where arms have restrictions designed into their physical construction so that even if the software were to be buggy or something were to go wrong, that it literally can't do something that would be considered unsafe. Now, and another important aspect of this way of thinking is that models become performative when they're incorporated into automation. Anytime you use a model, which was necessarily imperfect, you made a subjective choice, whether it's an optimization objective or whether it's a design of an algorithm, of a heuristic. It doesn't really matter, but because there's no perfect model, the choice of the models that sit inside of these automations are sort of both subjective and ultimately performative. And so we really take a strong stance on the application of sort of rigorous science to the consequences of choices in automation in social and economic systems, to try to make sure that we aren't setting ourselves up to harm someone or to sort of have some unintended consequences. There's not as much of this as I would like, but I think there's an ongoing push for a more engineering ethics perspective to social and economic systems, and it's part and parcel with the movement towards more transparent, more accountable AI. But in this case, more applied in the context of economic infrastructures and governance processes. In my team, we developed a Python package called CAD-CAD. It's called Complex Adaptive Dynamics Computer-Aided Design, and we use it to facilitate this kind of modeling-based science where we have models of the world and we have sequences of actions or input data from a real system, and we mix the process of using machine learning-like methods and system identification techniques to better understand how the system evolves, project into the future, and use those insights to make decisions either for design or for operations and governance. And I don't want to belabor it too much, but I wanted to show an example of a short video from, there we go. This is of a relatively simple crypto economic mechanism, but it's actually quite common. It's a sort of idealized market that's implemented as a smart contract. And in particular, it's interesting because it's being viewed here in its sort of configuration space form. It has a area preserving mechanism, and it has a sort of slope of that green line preserving mechanism. And although we're looking at it fit with real data and it's really evolving over time based on people's real actions, what you're actually seeing is its digital twin or its instantiation in code, which represents its formal restrictions. The movements along the blue arc are area preserving, and the motions that are sort of moving the blue arc back and forth are actually preserving the slope of the green line. And it's important to understand these kinds of configuration spaces because when we start to analyze these things and look at what works and what doesn't work, we want to have an understanding of what makes something survive. So there have been lots of crypto economic mechanisms, very few of whom have really taken up heavy use. And in practice, what we found is the ones that have really survived are the ones that have strong mathematical properties of the underlying system, even if the people who developed them and deployed them didn't understand totally or know about these strong mathematical properties. So in seeking to design new systems, we look to sort of design and assert these kinds of strong invariant-based properties. Now, I'm going to kind of switch this back to something a bit more social to wrap up. That particular model was developed by Marcus B. Koch, who's here on second on this list. But this list is actually a computational method using a graph of contributions over many years, and the list extends quite far, but it's essentially taking data from GitHub and discourse forums and a variety of other sources. It's building a giant graph of contributions to a set of projects, and it's running PageRank on it and using that PageRank to score things. And you're seeing the sort of top ranking contributions and top ranking people over the last 2 years or so. But really, this is an experimental technology at creating transparency in co-creation in these kinds of communities. And what you're seeing is a part of the prototype for SourceCred, which I presented on at Complexity Weekend last year. And this particular prototype was integrated with a Aragon DAO by a group called Metagame, reverse engineered by another group on a project called Aracred, and it is currently in use by a community working on a thing called token engineering. And so all the links are here on the right. I'm going to make these slides available afterwards, but I encourage you to explore what people are doing using these different tools to create transparency, to govern decisions, and to coordinate in a very internet native way. And sort of with that, I'm going to comment that basically I see the sort of political economy as an evolving shape of cyberspace. And I really like to point out that there's this adaptive feedback or co-evolution between our social systems and our, and the world that we live in through modifying the physical or technological environment that we interact in. And so we sort of recognize that then we have a really interesting perspective on economics. And in particular, I like the sort of Hayek way of describing it as sort of telling us how little we actually know about what we can design. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't design things. We are designing things, but we can take a very complex systems sort of reminder to be careful and not to just do things and risk unintended or negative consequences. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to this weekend.
Thank you, Zargham. An excellent talk, extremely interesting. You can depart the Jitsi, and I'll introduce our keynote speaker of the evening. Our keynote speaker is Professor Carlos Gershenson. Carlos is a tenured professor at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He is really a true contributor to complexity science in every area, from the mathematical to the philosophical, as well as the outreach and education and accessibility. And it's really an honor to introduce you, Carlos. In 2017, you spoke for a Stanford Complexity Group event, and it was truly a life-changing experience. So I really appreciate that you're coming out to give this talk for our Complexity Weekend and for a 1-hour keynote. Please take it away. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Dan, and the rest of the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me just share my presentation. And
I can't see your...
Can you see it properly?
Not yet, not yet. Looks perfect, Carlos. We can see your slides on the left, so if you want to do the full screen presentation, but thanks for also enabling the picture-in-picture on the bottom right. Looks perfect. Continue.
Yep, good. So I thought of using a recent collaborative effort from many colleagues from the complex systems community. We started with the hashtag complexity explained, and I mean, we have used the term complexity in lots of different contexts, and it's a very common word, but it acquires different meanings depending on the context that it is used. So that can lead to sometimes confusion or vagueness when different people speak about complexity using the same word, but with different meanings. So let's say I'm not going to give a strict definition of complexity, but to try to give some insight on what makes a system complex, we can go to its etymology. Complexity comes from the Latin plexus, which means entwined. So something complex is not necessarily something complicated or something chaotic. It's rather something that is difficult to separate. Precisely, that's the meaning of the word. Something that is entwined is difficult to separate. And why something might be difficult to separate? It is because you have relevant interactions between its components. And this means that you cannot study in isolation the components of a complex system and expect to understand the behavior if you just do that. However, we usually use in science and in engineering what is known as the reductionist approach, which has been very successful, but it is limited with complex systems by their very definition. A reductionist approach basically tries to simplify and isolate the components of a system in order to be able to predict. And if you have relevant interactions, then by definition, this approach is not sufficient. And there are plenty of examples. So, for example, in a team sports, basketball, soccer, whatever, it's not enough to have a description of the players. You need to have a description of how they interact, because you could have an all-star team, but if they are not properly coordinated, they won't be as good as a team which perhaps doesn't have star players but are very well coordinated. And so still, I mean, in spite of having this definition at the Conference on Complex Systems in 2017 that we organized in Cancun, one of the main speakers, Laszlo Barabashi, launched a challenge to the community that, I mean, he's more from the network science community, even when he has also contributed to complex systems. And he told, well, one of the things that this community should do is to define what a complex system is, so that people from outside the community can have a good understanding. So we took up the challenge, many people from the community, and the results you can find in the Complexity Explained website. There's also a link from the Complexity Weekend website, so maybe you already went through this, and let's say there's the list of the people who contributed more, but there's many more who contributed or suggested one way or another. So indeed, it's a collaborative effort. So I will use this as a guiding help to mention different aspects of complex systems. So we already mentioned that complexity means that you have a collection of components that are difficult to separate. And then there are other properties that are common or are a consequence of the interactions of complex systems. So this demands new tools, new methodologies, new descriptions, new ways of thinking for understanding and describing and building and controlling complex systems. And precisely because the traditional methods we had were based on a reductionist approach, which it's not bad, it's just not appropriate for complex systems. And I mean, this cartoon kind of explains what we have been facing with many complex problems where you have lots of causes, therefore not a single solution will be enough. And now with the pandemic, we can see lots of examples of bad decisions which are made with a reductionist approach. So in this document of Complexity Explained, we mentioned these 7 concepts that I will use through the presentation. So there are interactions, emergence, dynamics, self-organization, adaptation, interdisciplinarity, and methods. And we already mentioned the relevance of interactions in complex systems. If there is something that characterizes complexity, it's interactions. To distinguish it from, let's say, from complicated or chaotic systems, we can look at the opposites of each. So the opposite of something complicated or difficult is something easy. The opposite of something chaotic is something predictable or ordered. The opposite of something complex is something separable. So if you can study the components of a system in isolation, then that's not complex. So the relationships between components are relevant, but also with environment. And there are lots of implications of considering the relevance of interactions. And perhaps a very easy example that some of you already know is the game of life, which was proposed by John Conway 50 years ago. And actually, John Conway passed away a few weeks ago from COVID-19. And it's a cellular automaton, which means that you have cells in a grid which can take values between 0 and 1. And it's an automaton because you have rules that determine the dynamics in this grid. So each cell changes its state depending on how many living neighbors it has. So if around a living cell, which is represented with a 1, there are more than 3 neighbors, meaning that there are too many, it will die because it won't have enough resources or it's too crowded. If there are very few neighbors, maybe it gets lonely or too cold, and it also dies. So in order for a cell to survive, it requires 2 or 3 neighbors. If more than 3 or less than 2, then it will die. And if around a dead cell there are 3 neighbors, there will be a new cell born in that position. Now, it doesn't matter the precise position of the neighbors, just the total sum. And here in this simulation, you can see that if there are few cells, it will die. With 3 cells, you have an oscillating structure. You add another cell, you get a stable structure. You add another cell. You can say it reproduces. You add another cell. You start getting some non-trivial dynamics. So there are some stable structures because they all have 2 or 3. All the cells have 2 or 3 neighbors, but then there are some unstable or active regions where there's some dynamic going on. But then you can see that there are also some moving structures. They're preserving their shape while moving in space, and these are called spaceships or gliders if they're diagonal. And there's a whole zoo of different structures that one can build in this cellular automaton. And of course, in the rules, there's nothing that tells you there will be movement in space. We can see this as an emergent property that will define emergence in a moment. So here we have spaceships that shoot gliders that when they collide, they start building glider guns, which shoot gliders. So you have structures that generate structures that generate structures that generate structures. So actually, you can build a universal computer or any computable function can be computed within the game of life, which of course is not trivial from the simple rules that one has. And this is one last example from the game of life. So you have a spaceship which is moving in space. Actually, there's a stream of spaceships, so they collide with other spaceships and annihilate each other. And we will see that which structures are producing these spaceships in a moment. So there are some spaceship guns. And then around there's some other structures that seem to be some circuitry computing something. And then we will see what it's computing. So it turns out that you can compute the game of life in the game of life. Well, of course, if you can compute any computable function, then you can compute it yourself. But it's not trivial to deduce from the rules of the game of life, which are extremely simple, that you will be able to have such rich behavior, because richness is not in the elements of the system, it's in the interactions. And because of that, traditional approaches where you can predict the future of a system with initial and boundary conditions are not sufficient, because here we have what Stephen Wolfram calls computational irreducibility. This means that in order to reach the future, you need to go through all the intermediate steps, because the interactions generate information which will define the future. And you don't have access to that information until the interactions take place. So initial conditions, boundary conditions, the loss of the system, we have all of this in the game of life. We don't have access to the future. We don't have a shortcut to the future if it's not by computing all the intermediate steps. And that's the same with all complex systems. And that's why we need computers to study complex systems, because in a piece of paper or a blackboard, you can't do this. Okay, so emergence can be thought of some mystic property, because let's say it also has lots of meanings, but in the scientific study of complex systems, it's not mystic at all. It's simply properties that are present at one scale that are not present at another scale. So for example, we can know everything about gold atoms, but this will not tell us what the properties will be of a bar of gold. For example, its color, its malleability, its conductance. These are emergent properties. Another example, we can know everything that there is to know about carbon atoms, but if we don't know how they are arranged, in the sense that it could be graphite or nanotubes or buckyballs. I mean, the material properties are very different, but the components are the same. So, or diamonds, and the organization is of course relevant. So the properties of the organization are dependent not only on the properties of carbon, but on how the different atoms of carbon are arranged in a larger molecule. And examples of emergence, it's also life, because cells, like in this case, there's a white blood cell chasing a bacterium. We could say that it's just a bunch of molecules, but molecules are not alive. The cells are alive. Where does life come from? We can say that it's an emergent property of the interactions of the component of cells. So complex systems are, in most cases, dynamic. And depending on these dynamics, we can learn about different aspects. We already mentioned that because of interactions generating novel information, we are limited in how much prediction we have of a complex system. And moreover, it's common to have nonlinear interactions, and this will, let's say, this is indeed related to chaos, to deterministic chaos. This will also limit our prediction. And also, there are different regimes that we have identified in different models and phenomena and systems. So there might be chaotic dynamics or order dynamics or critical dynamics, which are more or less a balance between both. And also, usually chaotic dynamics are fragile in the sense that a small change propagates through the system. So we can say that this is fragile. And a robust system, it's one which does not change its functionality. So if a perturbation does not change the behavior of the system, then we can call it robust. But then more recently, the idea of antifragility has been studied in the sense that an antifragile system benefits from noise or from perturbations. And this, at the beginning, might sound counterintuitive because, for example, if we send fragile package, let's say some crystal cups by post, we will put a label, fragile, do not shake, handle with care, because the perturbations would destroy it. If we send something robust by post, I don't know, some rocks, some logs, we don't put anything because we don't care whether it's handled with care or not. That will not affect the contents of the robust package. However, if we have an anti-fragile package, we would put a label, please shake, mishandle, because the more it's shaken, the better it will reach its destination. And this sounds counterintuitive, but for example, if you have, well, in Mexico, we have aguas frescas, which is like fruit pulp mixed with water and sugar. and if you just let it stay, everything goes to the bottom. So you need to shake it so that it has proper flavor. So I suppose it's the same with some cocktails. So yeah, those are anti-fragile drinks. But the immune system is another example of anti-fragility, in the sense that if babies are not exposed to different illnesses, then meaning that they are kept in a extremely hygienic environment when they are small, their immune systems don't develop, and they will have a greater tendency to develop allergies, and the response to illness will be, say, not as appropriate as people who were trained by putting dirt on their mouths. However, doesn't mean that, hey, let's all expose our children to all the bugs that they might find. It's difficult to find what's the precise amount of dirt that will lead to the most efficient immune system. Another example is exercise. So when we exercise, we hyperventilate, meaning that our cells should age faster because of oxidation. We have more oxygen in our bodies, and in theory, this would oxidize our cells, and let's say that would be problematic. However, our body generates antioxidants which overcompensate the oxidation of our increased breathing. So actually, they have exercise has a rejuvenating effect. So they will overcompensate, and by this, we can say that it's better to do exercise. But maybe if you run a marathon every day, then it will be already too much, and you will age faster than if you do moderate exercise. So another example of the dynamics is the slower is faster effect. So this effect was first described with crowd behavior about 20 years ago, but perhaps it's easier to understand with sports. So this is the 100-meter butterfly final in the World Championships in Rome in 2008. And in lane 4, there's Čavić from the Czech Republic, who set a world record in the morning. And in these finals, Michael Phelps sits in lane 5. And in a sports competition, the question is how fast should you go? If you are running a marathon and start with the pace of 100-meter dash, you will burn out. But if you go out too slow, then let's say you won't be as fast as you can. So for example, here in lane 4, we see that Čavić goes all out from the start, approaching 50 meters. He's more than a body length ahead of Phelps, below his own world record pace. Approaching 75 meters, still ahead of Phelps, a half meter. That line is the world record pace. But the race is 100 meters, not 75. And by a nail, world record, and that world record stood more than 10 years. Phelps opened not as fast as Čavić, but at the end, he broke the world record. So, of course, he didn't open as fast as he could. But the fastest pace for 100-meter butterfly depends on not opening as fast as you can. So this is intuitive, and the experiments of evacuating a room was reproduced a few years ago by students and professors from Universidad de Navarra in Spain. So on the left, people are orderly exiting a room, and on the right, they're rushing. So we could assume that they are panicking or rushing, or let's say, trying to get out as fast as possible. So we have this slower is faster effect, because where people are not pushing, they have a constant flow, whereas when they are trying to go out faster, the friction generated at the entrance, of course, this depends on the width of the door, crucial, but it creates what we could call a turbulence. So it's similar to the difference between laminar flow and turbulent flow in fluid dynamics. And it turns out that this effect is also observed in sheep, because they are pushier in colder days than in warmer days. So again, the left side, it's a bit of a warmer day, and on the right side, a colder day. So they're a bit more pushy. And again, on the left, there's something like laminar flow, and on the right, something like turbulent flow. And trying to get in faster will lead everyone to getting slower. So, I mean, what can we conclude? That people behave like sheep, or perhaps something more useful is to study the general aspects of the slower is faster effect, meaning that it's counterintuitive. What will be the effect of the individual decisions on the dynamics of the system? And of course, this can have practical applications. This video was taken a few years ago, one of the stations in Mexico City Metro, the ladies section. So if you want to get in, you need to go through the window. And of course, no one can go in, no one can go out. The system is collapsed. Not only this train cannot leave the station, all the trains behind cannot move, precisely at the hour when you need greater throughput. So how to change the behavior? I mean, it's not that people enjoy pushing each other. Well, maybe some people enjoy it, but I'm sure that most people are stressed by these situations and would prefer to have a more pleasant commute. But even if you don't want to push, if you want to board the train, you need to push. Otherwise, you'll never reach your destination. So how to do this? It seems like a very difficult thing to do. So let me first show you how this station looks nowadays. So this is the ladies section. People queue, and the queues go up the stairs. And if you notice, it's not that we brought Japanese or German passengers who, let's say, supposedly are more ordered than Mexicans. It's same people that were pushing each other and jumping through the windows now are orderly queuing. And what we did was only to put these signs on the platforms, which indicate where the doors will open. And these serve as mediators, first of all, giving information where people shouldn't stand, so people can exit the train. I mean, that was our intention, but we didn't assume or imagine that people would queue. That was an emergent behavior. But it's for everyone's benefit that queues are formed, to the point that in stations without the signs, people started queuing as well. And the thing is that here, it's a video of another station. It became viral, rush hour, so the station is completely packed, but still people are ordered, forming queues. And it's no longer necessary to push, because let's say if the train is full and you don't fit, you'll be the first one to board the train. So there's less incentive to try to force your way into the train. And also, people reported there have been less pickpocketing and sexual assaults as well, because if, let's say, everyone is crowded, there many people used to take advantage of that. So again, we didn't change the passengers. What we did was the way they interacted. So this suggests that, for example, in economics, we won't change businessmen, but maybe we can change their interactions to have a healthier economy. We won't change teachers or doctors or politicians, but if we change their interactions, probably we can change our educational system, our healthcare system, our political system. And we did this with simulations of crowd dynamics, because of course it's very expensive to assume I think it will work this way, and then it doesn't work out that way. So for example, first we had the idea that we will have dedicated doors, so people would enter through the extreme doors and exit through the center doors, because each wagon has 4 doors. But with simulations, we realized that it's not better even when people don't face each other when exiting or entering the train, because you end up with half the doors to enter, half the doors to exit. So overall, the time is the same. And self-organization can be observed in many natural systems, such as flocks of birds, schools of fish in swarms, the Mexican wave in stadiums, and it can be described as a global pattern of behavior, which is a product of the interactions of the components. So we can use this idea, this concept of self-organization, not only to understand natural systems, but to build adaptive systems exploiting self-organization. And one of the first applications that we had was on traffic light coordination already more than 15 years ago. Well, first of all, I should say that if we just improve traffic flow for cars without trying to improve other means of transportation, this would just promote or motivate more people to drive, saturating even more the streets, so it could be counterproductive. So let's say if some city would eventually apply something like this, it should go alongside with mechanisms for restricting how many cars are on the streets. If you just have better traffic lights but double the density, then of course it will be worse than the current situation. So here again in simulations, on the left we see traditional traffic light coordination that tries to optimize flow but ends up in gridlock, and on the right hand with the same density self-organization where you have maximum flow in every intersection. It means that there's always a vehicle crossing every intersection. You cannot do better than that. We apply this also to scenarios with autonomous vehicles, and
Carlos, I'm just losing your audio for a few seconds. Maybe if you could just repeat the last point.
Show with these simulations is that if you have autonomous vehicles but traditional traffic lights, it's worse than if you have traditional cars, traditional drivers with self-organizing traffic lights. If you have both, greater difference than the autonomous vehicles it's better to have there, but it makes a greater difference to coordinate the traffic lights, because if not, even if you have great reflexes by autonomous cars, then let's say they will get stuck in behind red lights anyway. And with colleagues from Hungary, we extend
Carlos
to 3 dimensions to
Carlos, if you can hear me,
quadcopter traffic. It's easier. Yes.
Carlos, could you just maybe reload the window? We just had a few seconds of lag only on this last slide about the self-organizational behavior, but maybe just reload the page and reshare the screen at this point, and we'll pick it up from there.
Sure.
Thank you, Carlos. We're getting a lot of really awesome comments and connections between the game of life and real world complexity. People are asking about, I'm going to kick out Carlos from this Jitsi. People are asking questions about how the boundary conditions and the rules of these models influence their outcomes. People are asking questions about what the bottlenecks are for different kinds of thought. People are talking about how their different background leads them to perceive Carlos' lecture from different perspectives. This is a fun and unique component from all online events, where in the middle of a keynote, you get the surprise commentary from the introducer. Thank you, Carlos. It looks great. You can just reshare the screen and we'll go from there. Yep, looks perfect. Continue, Carlos. Thanks so much.
Yep, it seems the videos were too heavy for the bandwidth. So, I mean, there are other examples also with public transportation regulation where we use self-organization to achieve, in some cases, even better than optimal performance. Also applied to bureaucracies, to it can be applied to logistics. The advantage of using self-organization as a paradigm is that you need to pre-specify a problem. Instead of trying to solve a problem that because of novel information in the interactions, probably it will change. It's, I mean, the technical term for this is a non-stationary problem. The optimum is shifting. And in some cases, the solution shifts the problem itself. So you need a system that will be adapting constantly to changes in the problem. And it's difficult to specify a problem that it's non-stationary. So self-organizing systems can adapt constantly to changes in a problem because you're not defining the solution, you're defining the interactions of the components, and then the components will be actively searching constantly for solutions depending on the current situation. So for complexity, self-organization can be a much better solution because they give adaptation and robustness. So speaking about adaptation, we can, it's necessary when dealing with complexity because since we have limited predictability, we would like to predict everything that might happen, but with complexity, we're limited. So we need to build adaptive systems so that they can react in a useful way to change that will occur. And we can see that learning and development and evolution are particular types of adaptation at different time scales. So learning is the short time scale, development through a lifetime, evolution across generations. And we can have internal and social, environmental adaptation. So there are lots of different mechanisms that will give adaptation, and it's something that it's deeply intertwined with complexity to the point that John Holland spoke about complex adaptive systems, considering adaptation as an essential property of complexity. And interdisciplinarity is also quite common in complexity because a few years ago, I edited a book, Complexity 5 Questions, and there was the question whether complexity was a science or a proto-science or perhaps never would be a science, in the sense that we would have, let's say, majors in complexity or faculty of complexity or institutes. I mean, is complexity a science or tools or just some fashionable sect? And let's say with time, it seems that rather than being a science like biology or chemistry with a specific field of study, complexity is a way of doing science because we will have relevant interactions in all disciplines. So rather than being a separate or a new discipline, it's a new way of doing science and engineering that applies to all disciplines, and it has been absorbed in all disciplines, in some faster than others. and it's not replacing traditional approaches, it's complementing them. And because this interdisciplinarity becomes even more important, because on the one hand, complexity is such that we cannot have full understanding of a complex systems if we have let's say, just one discipline to study a phenomenon from. So this motivates interdisciplinarity. And we have seen this in bioinformatics, in computational social science, sociophysics, and so on. So as an example, some of the work that we've done with colleagues from the Physics Institute on statistical linguistics, we were interested in studying language evolution, and we use for this the Google MBooks dataset, which is available. So basically, Google was scanning all the books it could get its hands upon, and they scanned like 4% of all books ever written until 2009, that the Supreme Court told them that they were infringing copyright law. And this allows us to see what were the most popular words in different languages in different years of data from 1800 until 2009. So here in the left bottom part of the plot, we put the rank of different words. So in English, the word the is always at the first rank, is the most common word for all the years. The second rank is off, the third is and so on. Those don't change the rank. And as you increase the rank, the variation also increases. So we define a measure we called rank diversity, which measures how many words occur for each rank. And what we saw is that these curves are basically universal for all the 6 Indo-European languages that we studied: English, German, Russian, Spanish, French, and Italian. And also, this applies not only for words, but also for n-grams. So d-grams would be pairs of words, trigrams, sequences of 3 words, and so on forth, until pentagrams. And finally, the methods that are necessary to study complex systems, we have several that have been put forward. And Hans Pagels in the late 80s referred to computers as telescopes for complexity, because just as before we had telescopes, we couldn't see, let's say, beyond Saturn, and even so, with the telescopes we had 100 years ago, we couldn't see galaxies beyond our own. So if we don't have the proper tools, we won't be able to study many phenomena. In a similar way, without microscopes, people would say that infectious diseases were caused by humors. And what's humor? Well, humor is that which makes you sick. And you can even, this from the name of diseases, like influenza comes from the Italian influence, which referred to the astrological influence of the planets, that was what made you sick. So without a microscope, you have no idea what's making you sick, even less how to deal with it. And it was once we identified pathogens that we were able to develop different cures and vaccines to prevent and heal these diseases. So it's the same. If we are limited to the computational abilities of our tiny brains, even with a huge blackboard, we will be able to handle maybe 2 or 3 variables. But if we want to study a system where we have hundreds of relevant variables, we need a computer. And another advantage is that we have data as we never had. Every 2 years, the amount of data available or produced by our civilization doubles. And also many tools that are becoming more and more popular and more accessible. So for example, in the 80s and 90s, okay, there were computers, but it was very difficult to program. Nowadays, it's very, well, it's relatively easy for people without a strong mathematical background to program and to run simulations of social systems, of ecological systems, of economic systems. So computational methods are being applied in more and more disciplines. So this allowed by formalisms such as agent-based modeling, which is much more natural as opposed to differential equations, and networks which have its origins in graph theory in the last 20 years have become very popular to model complex systems because they're composed by nodes and links, and it's very natural to describe the components of a complex systems as nodes and their interactions as links. So there has been also lots of advancements using these tools and methods for understanding complex systems. So we can say that this is a oversimplification of what science does. We have an idea and then we contrast it against data, and in most cases our idea is wrong, and we basically have a systematic exploration of ideas until we get something that more or less satisfies our observations. And what we're able to do with all these concepts and methods and tools from complexity is to accelerate this. So it's not that we are suddenly much smarter than previous scientists, is that now we have the tools to explore ideas and hypotheses and to contrast them in a much faster way. And also to the point of automatizing them in a certain way. So like this, we're able to move faster and yonder in science and engineering because we have the tools that, let's say, extend our abilities. So returning to this idea, whether complexity is a science proto-science or just something fashionable that will be forgotten in a few years, I think that's not so important, let's say, what name we use it, but whether it's useful and allows us to solve problems that we were unable to solve without complexity. And if, let's say, it doesn't provide any new solution with these approaches, then it will be hand-wavy. But I think it's proving itself useful, and it's also changing our worldview, because the success of the reductionist approach made some implications on how we describe and how we see ourselves in our worlds, in our world. And let's say it's becoming, as I mentioned, a way of doing sciences. And we are seeing that science is not so much a tool that we should use and exploit for our own purposes to dominate nature and control it for our own goals, but rather we are understanding what's our place in the universe and to be able to coexist with all the complexity that surrounds us and also the complexity that we are producing. So finally, I just invite you to visit Complexity Digest. You can subscribe for free. It's a weekly newsletter, or you can follow us on social networks. And let's say we share the latest news and research related to complexity. So if there's time for questions, I would be happy to.
Thank you, Carlos. Just one question that was really excellent from the chat related to the game of life. We'll just ask one quick question and let you go. Was how do the rules and the boundary conditions and the initial conditions intersect to generate complexity? And then how do we extrapolate or generalize from these very clean simulations like game of life to the real messy real world?
Yep. So some rules you can say beforehand that they will not produce interesting behavior, meaning that, let's say, if you just have whatever state you have, it will lead you to some final state, and that's basically no dynamics. So those are easy to discard. but it's not easy to say that you will have or not complexity, let's say, given some rules. So that's why you need to explore computationally, let's say, this computational irreducibility is present in not only in cellular automata, but of complex systems. So basically, only a posteriori you can see whether, for example, a simple program will give you universal computation or not, and then how to relate it with more realistic systems. Of course, it depends on what you want your models for, because in many cases models should be predictive, but models are also useful if explanatory. So in many cases, such as the game of life, let's say it's not modeling any real phenomenon, and if you want to reproduce some observations, then you have some criteria, and if you want to have some further insights, then having abstract models is better than having highly detailed models. So it's also whether you are more interested in reproducing qualitative aspects of an observation or quantitative aspects. And
Carlos, we're going to let you return. We're going to let you return to the game of life, the true game of life, the one that surrounds you. So thank you so much for the keynote. And
a pleasure.
We really hope to stay in touch. We really appreciate this so much for our community. And we'll be in touch. And thank you.
Yeah, enjoy the weekend. Bye.
See you later, Carlos. Wow. Fun times with these keynotes and talks. From right now, 7:33 p.m. till 8 p.m., we're going to have about 27 minutes to just, if you want to take a break and relax, you're welcome to. Otherwise, please join us at the online town that we're posting in the chat right now. So join at that online town. And just in case there's anybody whose video isn't working for online town for whatever reason, I'm going to stay on the live stream, and I'm going to be using online town through Jitsi just to show you how it works. But I hope to see you all there in just a few seconds, and hopefully you'll get a little experience of the play of online town. So let's get right over to it. All right, here I am in online town. So this is an online space where you can walk around and hang out and talk to people, and you're only able to see people who are pretty close to you spatially. And my microphone or my video may work or not, just because I'm also live streaming. And let's just see if everybody has made it over there. Nice. Hermanth, I see you. Great to see you. Jessica, nice to see you. Sean, hello.
Oh, Dan, your microphone is off.
It's on the Jitsi. It's just off on this one. Actually, wow, I can have it on both. So we're testing out some of the features here. It's on the Jitsi. It's just on. Thing is, we're getting some fractals. Greetings, Anna. So just for those who are just watching, what you can do on our website here, Online Town, these are really some great fellows who we were lucky to meet and interact with. This is going to be a really unique online space where we're going to have it open 24/7. So we know that a lot of you are watching this live stream in replay because of time zone differences or scheduling. That's totally okay. We hope that the talk format of the live stream will enable you to watch the content as it was delivered. And then during the times when you're able to share with us, we'll be able to hang out in here 24/7. So whether it's 1 a.m. for you or whether it's 1 p.m. for you, you should be able to drop in here. And by looking at these little colors off on the side, you can tell where the other people are. So let's just explore around a little bit. I'm going to find a nice quiet spot to be alone with my thoughts after those excellent talks. So we heard first from Sean. We heard first from Sean with the disaster response. He really brought our attention to the criticality of complexity science and how complexity in the real world means responding when people need help the most. Then, in our second talk, we heard from Sudebi and Probal of the Epicenter Consulting in India, and they really brought the focus to the facilitated hackathon component, to these big questions about how curiosity, vulnerability, trust, intercultural communication, how these topics all line up when we're trying to do things from a complexity point of view. And then our third facilitator talk was Michael Zargham, who talked about several of his projects and related work in dynamical systems, in blockchain, in cyber physical systems engineering. These are really areas where some of the more modern developments in complexity are happening, but by juxtaposing the talks in the order that we had them and through the perspective of each of these facilitators, I hope it became clear that it's always about the team. It's really always about the data and about the collaboration, making sure that people feel included at every step in the design process. So let's go see how people are interacting around here. And then in our keynote, we were really honored to have Carlos Gershenson give a speech about what is complexity, complexity explained. One example that really stayed with me was the behavioral norms around the metro and the faster is slower. And he showed the faster is slower with the sheep and how on a low temperature day, it's like the flow is more effective. And on a high temperature day, it can actually lead to not just faster acting sheep leading to faster escape, but almost the opposite. It can actually be a question about when the fast moving sheep create turbulent flow, and that doesn't always lead to the fastest escape. Rather, it leads just to turbulent flow. And so there's other examples of faster is slower. For example, in ant research, people have explored how ants evacuating a small space speed up or slow down when alarm pheromone is released. And again, there's been a faster or slower effect in the ants, where the slower that individual ants walk, the more that their dynamics are kind of like a flowing glass, and the less that they're like a fracturing glass. And so sometimes when there's a lot of pressure on a system and it's too rigid, then it can actually break and undergo failure modes like trampling or fracturing, rather than the kind of laminar flow that we would want to see for high efficiency. So here we are in Online Town. As we come near the seashore, we hear the beautiful, beautiful waves of this totally realistic ocean. I feel like I'm at the ocean. I feel like I'm at Ocean Beach in San Francisco, having long walks on the beach, talking about complexity with myself. Let's go see what everyone else is up to and see if we can look at any insights from the chat. Greetings, Sean. So after that brief little visit to the beach with my friends, now it appears that I'm trapped in a wall. This is the kind of stuff that happens when you're live, you know. You get trapped in a wall. What are you going to do? You might just reload the window. Let's see how that works. We're right back in a healthy position. choose our avatar. Let's hear what some other people are talking about.
Well, I think it's just like slowly trying to introduce the different mindsets. A lot of environmental problems have engineering solutions, and it's hard to switch the architecture.
So excited.
How to escape from that region. Where can I be more free? Where can I explore complexity with people who really want to learn about complexity? Maybe over by the ocean, where I was earlier. This is the kind of content that, although it's absolutely must watch live, it's probably not going to be high viewership afterwards. It's all good. We're going to chop up the talks, make sure that everyone's talk is in a nice format. Let's go back through some of the chat messages and see what some people were discussing while I'm just not using this system. So we had Sean who wrote, part of the theory of this weekend conference is that complexity doesn't necessarily have a satisfying general definition. You almost need a specific problem in front of you before you can unpack the word complexity in that particular system's context. Want to help the homeless? Complexity in that system involves the overlap between sociology, mental health, drug dependency, economics and job markets, etc. Lots of interconnecting theories across many different science fields, making up a unique complexity definition for that particular problem. Very well said by Sean. Do a little other reading in this section. So we had a few questions about Carlos's talks. Somebody commented on Carlos's talks and as well as on the discussions that are following out. They said, these questions feel hopelessly vague. Absolutely. It's kind of a funny thing when the vaguest questions are also some of the most powerful questions about definitions. We've all been in experiences where a semantic debate usually means a meaningless one. So when someone says, well, that's just a point of semantics, they mean you're just arguing about what the word means. This isn't really a useful thing to consider. But then at the same time, some of the definitional questions, what is democracy? What is freedom? What is free will? What does it mean to have equity or equality? Some of these questions are also some of the most central questions in philosophy or in different fields. And part of complexity, and also, which is why it's so important that Sean had written, you almost need a specific problem in front of you before you can unpack the word complexity in that particular system's context. So we can almost juxtapose those two viewpoints, and we can almost say that complexity is the community of people that are ready to non-spuriously engage in the semantic discussion about what these terms mean, and then also get down into the details of the problem. And the reason why we need both is that if you're just talking about abstractions and not getting to the heart of the issue and the real applied solutions that matter for so many people, it's just abstraction without a ground. And on the other hand, if you're in the midst of an emergency and you're in the midst of a crisis, but you don't have any overarching frameworks or ways to draw insights from your experience, from other people's experience, then you're not going to be able to come to the most resilient solution to that emergency, especially when you think about it from a long-term team-based inclusion perspective. So it's really important to have both ends of the anchor, so to speak, both the abstract end where we're talking about what it means to have an interaction, what is a fractal, what is chaos, but then at the same time, and just as all of the talks today reminded us, it does come down into the specifics, and it really matters how we set up the specifics, because doing complexity science in many cases is simply the specifics. I know that one of the realizations or lessons about complexity science that was so interesting was seeing that professors who were affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute or giants of complexity, just people who were really absolutely state of the art in complexity, they wouldn't even use the word in every single publication. Maybe they'd have a paper about complexity in economics or complexity in ants, but it wasn't a word that they always came back to. It really did, even for these incredible researchers and productive people in different fields, it really came back down to the idea of solving problems for people and making resilient systems that were also equitable. And so when I understood that complexity was the community of people and the way of thinking that aligned like this, and it wasn't specifically just a buzzword that I would use to trigger some sort of a search algorithm or trigger someone's perception about the kind of viewpoint I was taking, it really was a step forward, a step into the unknown, because saying that you're coming from a complexity science perspective doesn't mean that you figured it out. It doesn't mean even that your team figured it out. It means that you're ready to engage on an adventure in a complexity science spirit. And so this live stream happening on a Friday night as we lead into our first ever all online complexity weekend content and facilitated hackathon experience, it's really a step into the unknown. I think on this live stream, we saw some of the technical fun. We had connections from the United States, from Mexico, from India. We were using free online platforms like Jitsi, and we hope that it worked out. And we set up everything we could, and then we go from there and we deal with it in the moment. And we hope that all of our participants do too. That's fun. And as JP wrote while we were dealing with some technical fun, he wrote, "It's what Ian Malcolm talked about in Jurassic Park, and how I'm by myself talking to myself, that's chaos." JP always bringing it back to understandable references for complexity and making complexity accessible. Let's read some more quotes. Here's somebody who brought up a quote from what Carlos wrote. They wrote, quoting Carlos Gershenson, "Complexity is a way of doing science." And another Carlos quote, he wrote or said, "Define not the solutions, but the interactions of the system." Those were both really interesting points. Just to speak to that first one about complexity as a way of doing science, I think that often science can be broken down into a threefold system. There's science as a way of thinking, what we may have learned in school with hypothesis and experiment and conclusions and updating your models. That's the first aspect of science as a way of thinking. The second aspect of science is science as a body of knowledge. So that's all the information, all the data, whether you call it a fact or not, doesn't really matter. But all the information and the claims that science accumulates, just the information that we learn about the world that helps us develop technology as well as come to a basic integrated understanding of the world. That's science in the second sense, as a body of knowledge. And then there's science as a career, which sometimes is aligned with the way of thinking and the body of knowledge, and other times it isn't. And when we looked at the slide from Sean in our introductory session in this live stream that really showed who we are as a Complexity Weekend community, about how there's not any group that's more than 50% of us. We come from academic and non-academic areas. More than a third of us are absolute beginners and learners in complexity. And I really hope that the rest of the people who identified as an expert in complexity also understand that being an expert in complexity is about retaining your domain expertise and your skills and your knowledge, while also having that beginner mind to some of these truly fundamental questions that no expert may have the answers to. And so where complexity fits in with these three types of science in relationship to Carlos's quote that complexity is a way of doing science. It's like complexity is a way of doing science that we're exploring as a complexity community. So let's just say it's related to the scientific method, but both JP, Carlos, and other speakers brought up some great points about how often complexity science starts with a more open-ended question, not just a hypothesis that's getting tested or not, but rather something that means more about the system or might be more project-oriented. So let's think about these other two areas of what it means to be science. There's science as a body of knowledge, and there's science as a career. Well, science as a body of knowledge is something that complexity science draws heavily on, but we also draw upon other sources of knowledge. So there's a lot of information and perspectives and experiences that are not considered classically part of the scientific knowledge. And part of complexity science is about expanding what it means. We don't just have the task of compiling all the data sets that other people think are data sets. We also have this question about including things that were missed out on by classical science. And so that's where I think complexity speaks to the difference between the body of knowledge computed by science and the body of knowledge that we're trying to build, which is also highly interactive. The last point, complexity as a career versus science as a career, that's the piece where there's the most unknown. Maybe it's even an unknown, depending on how you think about it. Each of our facilitators and our keynote speaker have persisted in a world that often made it challenging for complexity thinking to come to the front. Each of our facilitators is a resource for you to discuss about domain-specific issues, life, complexity in general, because each of these people have found a way to integrate the systems that we often are frustrated with or want to affect. They found a way to work within these systems to develop a complexity mindset as individuals and with their teams, and ultimately to be in a position where they can come and speak or work with the attendees of Complexity Weekend through their talks, through their sessions, their workshops, but also through direct mentoring. And it's through direct mentoring with complexity experienced people in your field or in different fields where this conference is really going to hopefully be special for you in the long term. We hope that you're going to be set up on Keybase in the teams and making the connections that are going to help you be in long-range collaborations with these teams that simply wouldn't have formed if not for complexity, if not for you wanting to get linked up all around the world with people who are also curious about these questions. So it's 7:54. In about 5 minutes, we're going to come back to the live stream and we'll have a 1 hour interactive activity. I'm just going to type into the general chat and just say 5 minutes till we rejoin the live stream for interactive activity. Hey, JP.
Hey, JP, there you are.
You're on live stream.
Oh, hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Here we are enjoying online chat. So.
Do you have anything to JP, I'd love to hear a few more words in these last minutes of our mixer about just complexity as a way of doing science and as a way of making communities happen.
In our way
that was one was most resonant with me. Like, there's one thing Carlos said where he was, I quoted it here. It was, okay, where? Before now.
Conversations.
Hello, everybody.
This is the fun.
Yes.
It's the fun of online town. Sorry, continue. There was overlapping, but continue, JP.
Yeah. So, Carlos said complexity is a way of doing science. I found this quote, and we can go. You can make infinitely small divisions when you're actually getting to formalizing science, and when it comes to actually producing say, research results on science. And you'll get there if you go down the formal route of academic science. That's kind of what you have to do. But the mindset and the mentality, approaching work in the sciences or your research, that's really where complexity, the complexity mindset comes to really shine. We're working with our working tagline of learn complexity by doing, and it's a community of practice. And I think that those things really encapsulate, our community of practice, that really encapsulates what we're trying to get to with complexity. You can kind of, go here and there and go like, oh, there's network theory, and is that really just graph theory? And, that's just a subset of mathematics. Or you can go like, what on earth do ant colonies have to do with studying chaotic orbits of asteroids, which all are kind of encompassed under the framework of educational program like complexity. So to me, it's really coming at that from synthesizing all this diverse stuff you accumulate during a scientific career, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, these stuff is pretty interesting, and these complexity people are pretty cool. Like, I want to be a part of that.
Cool. We have about 2 more minutes.
I'll throw in something like really pithy, and if I have to give like a slideshow, I'll be able to throw up some slides. But for me, it's just you get in there, you do it, and you're enjoying the people that are around you. Kind of a healthy attitude to be.
Awesome.
It seems like this weekend is looking to write a more internalized understanding of complexity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Once the internalized definition, that's what I refer to as like the synthesis. My background was just a ravenous curiosity. And a lot of the people that were talking about the most thing identify as complexity. So, once you hear people, Carlos gave a very, very high level overview, but the other talks were equally valuable. Each of those kind of talks touches on something that you're able to see the analogy between two, you're able to see the similarities between the dimensions.
Yeah, I was talking with, I think, Squasha earlier about the selection of talks.
So I think we're going to disconnect from Gather from Online Town just so that we can go back to the rest of the live stream. So I'll unshare my screen. Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to be continuing in the next session, which goes from 8 p.m. till 9 p.m. So 1 hour session from 8 to 9 PST. And we're going to have a conversation that's also going to be full of some interactive activities with Monica Kang, as well as my co-organizers, JP and Sean. So we're really looking forward to this facilitated chat and some interactive games. And we'll just, we'll give it a minute for people to rejoin. Somebody wrote about the complexity weekends online town space with an ocean, the seashore that we explored. They wrote, "We better have sunblock for tomorrow with this realistic ocean atmosphere." I couldn't agree more. Always wear sunblock. Always wear sunblock. So we'll just give everyone a minute to rejoin. Now it's 8 p.m. and Monica, JP, and Sean should be joining us at any moment. Really, the 3 facilitator talks by Sean, Sudebi, Probal, and Michael were something that I really want to go back and watch again. I want to see how, even though these three facilitators didn't pre-synchronize, they didn't discuss what they were going to talk about, it still was clear just from hearing their talks that they've all had such deep perspectives on complexity science, and bringing that together through their joint facilitation and through their joint mentorship, and then seeing how it becomes implemented and manifested in the context of the teams that you as the participants are going to be in, it's going to be really special.
Greeting is on.
Greetings, Monica. Greetings, Sean.
Hello, hello.
We continue the live stream discussion, and Monica, feel free to introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. So, hi, my name's Monica Kang. I'm an entrepreneur, author, and a curious person who's just super excited to be part of this weekend. There's particular parts about my background that I'm super pumped, particularly for this session and the whole weekend theme of complexity. I'm currently an innovation expert. I help companies around the world with my work at Innovators Box, how to rethink to be more creative, how to reframe your mind so that you rethink about culture and leadership. But before that, I used to work in nuclear weapons security, and I was having a blast because I was telling already the organizer team, hey, because this is past my bedtime, I might need to take a nap, but I couldn't because the conversation was so good. And I was just thinking about all the things I was reflecting back on my nuclear times, and even connecting back to innovation, which at the end of it is really reminding ourselves that and I hope all of you are thinking as well, is that no matter what our domain of expertise and background is, we all carry something, and we form a lens of perspective in what we think is true, what we think is different, what we think is difficult. And one of the things that I was already kind of processing and thinking about as
live streaming is on.
All right. As far as I can tell, it looks good. Please continue, Monica. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have to repeat the part that I said so far, though, right? Okay, so including moments like this, it is. Let me just make sure. Okay, I muted that. You know, thinking about in nuclear weapon security, there's always uncertainty you're dealing with nonstop. You know, and the part that I worked at previously was in forensics, where as the non-scientist working with other scientists, policymakers, and decision makers in securities, the number one question you constantly think about is like, how are these connecting the dots? These 6, 7 different people are different individuals with different roles that they have to communicate and collaborate together to find a single truth of solution. And sometimes it's just that one phone call that somebody did not answer, and sorry, that is the nightmare that we all wake up to next morning. And sometimes the next question then also, which I loved hearing from some of the presentation, is during security and safeguarding, it's like, how much money do you spend ahead of time when you have no idea when that might happen or how frequently that might happen? And that kind of perspective of how much do you weigh in how you make decisions and where do you prioritize has certainly made a difference in how I processed about complex decisions, complex worlds, and even situations like now, and completely connected to everything I'm continuing to build in creativity and where our conversation is. And so with that, I want to play my kind of other hat that I've been playing a lot more with the work I do, which is facilitation, and kind of diving a little bit deep, because, you know, what I hope you heard from my brief intro and me just sharing is that I am not ashamed to acknowledge that I am one of the newbies in complexity theory, and everything that we just went through, I myself was like just processing and learning. And as I said in the Keybase, I was just sharing that, you know, hey, actually me trying to process everything, I think I got a better understanding in the past few hours of them all sharing it. So shout out to all the folks also, as you were putting your comments in the general, to share about, you know, how you felt so far and perhaps how you want to dive in. Because in this part, what I want to do differently, and I don't know if we have the chats group ready, but we want to make sure that you all get to now mingle with one another, because it's one thing for us to be diving and like hanging out in the chat box, and like, I'm glad you had the online town moment, but we want you all to get to know each other, because hey, at the end of the day, yes, we are trying something new online, but it's human connection. And so do we have the Jitsi links ready so that we can share it maybe in the general?
Oh, yeah. Danny got the 5.
Sure. Why don't you go ahead and just set it up, explain how we're going to make this happen, and then when you're ready, just tell us to post it, and we'll drop it in the general.
Perfect. So as I continue to explain, the reason why I want you to start joining to some of these Jitsi links and join the different groups is that we are going to be able to dive a little bit deeper into some of these conversations we had on chat in person now with some of your smaller groups. And to make that fun, I have, our other organizer friends here where I'm going to actually have some Q&As because, hey, as one of the newbies, but also, as somebody who always likes to think about kind of processing big picture into actionable steps. And, for folks out there who are visionaries versus like detail oriented people, I'm kind of the one who likes to do both. And I hate sometimes when they're like, ooh, I totally love this big picture. Macro is great. Yes, we need to understand how it connects. But sometimes it's like, oh, wait, I want actionable steps. Like, what can I do with it? And so when you join these Jitsi link groups, you should be now joining other fellows, about 10 other individuals or so. And within those group, a few things that we'll ask for you to do is, take a moment to say hello, because we've been talking so much online, but we want you to intentionally now connect with some of the other folks. And so a few things is, because it's probably hard to hear our voice twice. And so for the first few minutes as you join in, just stay muted in your own Jitsi groups, maybe wave and say hello within your groups. But if you can just put in your chat box in the Jitsi links, and you'll notice that there's a little thing at the bottom hand next to the hand. If you hover over there, put it in the chat box, say hello, say your name, where you're tuning in from, why you're here, so that now you can match the name and the face and a little bit more than just the Keybase that we were at. And then if we also have the Jamboard link ready, I want you all to now get ready to open the Jamboard link, because that is now how we're going to virtually hang out in one location ready together. And while we do so, I'm going to have some questions queued up with these wonderful 3 folks, because I want to dig a little bit deeper into, and they have no idea yet. I have some gist, but they're about to find out as well. So are we ready? Are in their rooms?
Yep, let me just give people a minute while Sean is pulling up the Jamboard link, and we'll post an accessible Jamboard link into the general chat. We posted 5 Jitsi links, breakout 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So just go ahead and jump into one of those randomly, and just, you're going to be grouped with people who like the same number, 1 through 5. We're sorry. And just mute for now. Keep us on audio, and Monica will lead the way. And then when we're ready for the brainstorming session where we're going to start putting some ideas up, we'll have the Jamboard link accessible. So Monica, while people are joining the Jitsis, go ahead.
Perfect. So let me start with some of the first question. Actually, Dan, if I can circle back to you, since you were already helping out so much, I am curious, why did you even care to learn about complexity theory even in the first place, out of all the things you could have chosen to learn and invest your time?
It never felt like I was learning it or focusing on learning it. It felt like I was being included within a thicker thread, within a longer term narrative, and within a bigger community, a group of people who were really honestly and earnestly interested in the kind of transdisciplinary work that other people just talk about. And it was through going to Santa Fe Institute and meeting incredible people like JP that I really began to develop the close ties, and seeing how complexity could be realized in people's lives and in their careers across different sectors. That's what kept me interested and engaged.
Thank you for sharing that, and heartwarming, timely, because JP, I want to now go to you on that second question, because I am curious to hear, well, that's cool based on what we just heard about. You can learn all these different things, but I'm sure that while you've learned all these different things, there's a lot of surprises that happens along the way in any form of research. And so could you shed light into what was your most unexpected surprise learning that you've had in this learning?
What was my most that's a interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer it, because unexpected is are we looking at like a black swan event where it's like, oh, I didn't know that. By nature, I think a lot of this stuff is surprising. the thing that really strikes me, I guess, if we're talking about expectation violation, which is surprise, right? And then we can go into, you know, entropy and all the rest of this. But fundamentally, like when we're talking about surprise, I think the thing that always hits me is how quickly kids grasp onto it, and that's what's always really inspiring and energizing. Not to take your question in kind of a meta different direction, but you know, when you're talking about ecologies, or we're talking about chaos theory, or we're talking about self-organization, kids always have, you know, they always have these intuitive understandings of these things. So whenever you go up and by extension, the kid in all of us, not just kids generally, right? But it's the willingness of people who are beginning to learn complexity. Like, they already know a lot of the stuff. I think that's what's most, if I could embody one thing, that's what's most surprising, is how intuitive the stuff is. And then we deal along with the complex system science we get to, which is like, you know, the rigid formality and you know, paper writing and these things. But at its base is just how approachable most of the concepts we discuss are, and are universal. And to me, it's like you put down the lens of complexity, and all of a sudden the world gets a lot brighter and a lot more interesting. So I think that's what's most surprising. That's the coolest thing to me, is once you just get that little bit of like, oh, trees are fractals. And oh, there's this fractal geometry, and oh, that's couched within complexity generally. You know, the world gets a lot more richer. So that's what it is incredible to me. Once you know, unexpected. It's like how intuitive this stuff is.
I love that in so many magnitudes, because as I said, they did not know what I'm going to ask, and that's the beauty of it. Because as you all know, in what I'm learning about the complexity is that, yes, there are some system reactions that you do know, but the complexity is because you don't know what's about to happen, and they don't know what I'm going to ask. And so they are sharing their honest thoughts. And that's part of the beauty of, you know, walking your own talk. And thank you for sharing that, because one of the things that I was really inspired just learning a little bit through is just, yes, there are certain things that, oh, yes, so this relates to my past experience. Okay, so I can see this in my context of nuclear world, or I can understand this in my innovation, or I can understand this as somebody who travels all the time. And thank you for, you know, humbly bringing us back to, we were probably expert at this when we were all younger. How do we unlearn? Because one of the things that I loved from the beginning throughout the comments was just, can we all stay with an open mind? I heard that, I think, from literally almost every presenter, if you scroll all the way back through all the conversation that happened, and that's probably not a coincidence. And so thank you for confirming that, which leads to, Sean, you know, going to you, the question that I'm curious is, at the same time, you know, as somebody who did econ, and, you know, I had my nerd jokes in econ land where we would like have all these graphs and charts, and we were like, now I'm kind of dating myself, because like I need to like learn again. I forgot a lot of my econ jokes, but one thing, you know, we have supply demand, and like that's always been helpful. So one thing I'm curious is that I'm sure there's a lot of different graphs and charts and terminologies and jargons. Like what's at least, if we forget every terminology, what's like the one thing that you want to share with us that is going to be super helpful, that we can walk away and it's going to be practical, like supply and demand?
Sure. I think it would be one word, and that word would be model. And it's basically, how are you seeing the system? What are you considering? What are you not considering? And I think that's really where you get into how complexity helps as a problem-solving framework. Because if you're, say, for instance, you want to make a dent in the homelessness problem, for instance, if you're not considering, you know, mental health or basically the societal structure of how you get housing, and, you know, all like how banks work and all that, if you're not considering a lot of these variables, or what you would call it confounding variables in statistics, like they just go in and they wreck your statistics because you didn't account for them in your model, then that's kind of where we're at with a lot of these problems we're trying to solve now, where we've really taken kind of a reductionist approach, or we've put all the interactions in a term and ignored it, or, you know, you're basically making a model or a way of thinking about a system that is missing information that's key to its actual behavior. And complexity is really great because it just makes you go in with an open mind, like you're saying, and say, okay, consider everything that could be affecting the system. like my particular one in my hands right now that I'm trying to work on. Oh, that isn't actually important. I'll cut it out again. You can still be rigorous with your model and cut things out that aren't going to actually benefit your understanding, but you have to take that initial step of stepping back and seeing everything and then trim. And that's kind of the complexity thinking way that I've observed talking to everyone kind of related to this conference. And I think that's why they're so good at modeling. It's because they don't blind themselves right out the gate, basically.
Thank you for adding that. And if you have noticed, there's actually a keyword that all three of them have highlighted without them realizing it. And, if I find patterns into that, it's really going back to understanding our why. Dan has started with that. How do we stay curious? That JP has highlighted. And then Sean has highlighted, how do we make sure we think of the models in the perspective, which at the same way is, how is your frame of mindset? Where are you starting from? What perspective, what attitude are we starting? Even in the chat conversations, are we assuming kindness? If somebody is saying something that looks confusing, can we assume with kindness and say, can we untangle this to dive deeper? And with that being said, I see already a handful of folks who are in the Jamboard. Are we ready to now dive into this then? Do you have the green light? Okay, so for folks who are there, I hope you got around in the meantime, do a brief intro among yourselves, but we want to get to meet all of you. And so I'm going to do a second and also share because we want to hear all of you. So if everyone can see mine and then also little me on the side, I'm still here. So let's see. So the first question, if you are ready to mingle and explore, my question, oh, awesome. I have already some folks who have started writing. I want you to take a moment because as we all just had a moment to learn, I shared a little bit about a few things I'm passionate about and what we care. We heard a little bit about three organizers and what they cared about and how they even got to complexity. I'm sure there's a whole reason why where you are excited about what you care. Whatever that is, please take a moment to share it and, show us what is that. If you can write it, I know sometimes it's a little tricky. So if you want to create a Post-it, put some Post-its in it. And, maybe, feel free to see. Yes, I see some lines. I love it. So, as you continue to write those, I want to kind of continue our conversation because there's just so much more to dive into. So JP, if I can go back to you, I'm curious, from what I'm still understanding from a complexity, yes, even when we recognize it's from an inner child, there's so many layers and directions you can go. Can you share us a little bit more which direction you kind of dove a little bit more into your expertise and why that in particular?
That's a interesting question because I've gone two different ways that are a little bit, not quite diametrically opposed to each other, but two very distinct ways that still somehow managed to get encompassed in everything I've done under the umbrella complexity. First and foremost is age-based modeling. When I first got involved in complexity, I learned NetLogo, which we'll have discussions on that as time goes forward. It's a very, very good modeling tool for those of you who are not new to it or haven't passed it on your travels yet. NetLogo is excellent. The way I came to NetLogo was actually through these child's eyes because I did Logo when I was 6 years old. And when I was 23, somebody was using NetLogo, and I said, oh my God, it's a turtle. I know how to make these things move around. So it immediately connected to everything I'd kind of buried deep inside. So beginner's mind, and it all came back. So that's why I'm so enthused about, the sparkle of complexity. So age-based modeling and simple rules leading to complex behavior. That's kind of where my expertise lies. And then curiously enough, back in the day, I've done some work on technology forecasting. So this very, very, what we'll call hard mathematics, curve fitting, things like that, backcasting, forecasting, model testing. So the very, very rigorous, complexity science is always, complexity science as defined separately from like complexity generally, but the actual doing research, it's always this very interesting tension between kind of your formal mathematics and the way that these things fit into the established formal academia, if you will, so formal research, and then the bottom up, really interesting, creative, crazy stuff. So it's always this interesting tension. So if I were to describe, generally, I've done those two broad things. So we're looking at, this was actually a decade ago. We were looking at, information transmission rates and when we'll see price parity points and all this cool stuff. And lo and behold, here we are today, talking with each other in real time across the world via Zoom, or via Jitsi, an open source platform.
Who knew how world would be? I know many of us.
We saw it coming.
Oh, you did. Oh, that's true. Actually, my apologies. I'm a little behind in recognition.
So that's the interesting thing, So you have this bubbly, organic, like crazy science, and you have like the very rigid, formal science. And I think the fun thing about a lot of what we do is that interplay. It's not just all fun and games, like I was alluding to earlier. There is like a solid core and a very very professional side to a lot of what goes on in the complex systems sphere as well. So that's like my background formality in a nutshell, I think. So thanks for the question.
Thank you for sharing that. And as all of you are listening, I'm having a little bubbly moment over here, because thinking about, as you're communicating, as they're probably listening and being inspired, look at what happened at our beautiful whiteboard. Are you guys noticing this? So I'm curious, I'm already seeing patterns, I'm sure as they're listening, they're seeing a lot of connectivity. I see data, education, art, philosophy, solving people's problems. Yes, we're all about problem solving over here. This is why you're spending a dedicated weekend. You want to spend time with other people who want to do this, not just yes, we can do the binge watching next weekend, do that for next weekend. This weekend is all about problem solving, meeting new people. Yes, you got to do that to be part of this. You got to do it. Hope you're enjoying the group of people you're meeting right now in your separate links and making a difference. Dan, I'm curious to hear from what you're seeing. Is there any patterns that you're really excited to see in the whiteboard right now?
Well, one question I have is whether the Jitsi rooms should be talking or whether we'll give them time to speak amongst themselves. Is it okay if I answer that question first?
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking that. Yes, I think a creative way that we can address it is whether maybe you put our sound mute in between. I'm going to now gradually pass on to different questions. So please continue. The only cue is if you see the whiteboard moving, make sure your group has started to move, to keep commenting on that. But if you have an exciting conversation you want to briefly open up, please do. But you can please join us in between. So thank you.
All right, so just to clarify, people can mute the live stream, but leave it open. And then if they see the live stream switch slides to a different question, you'll see a blank board and you'll see a lot of people engaging on the third slide. Just jump over there. So the question was about what patterns might arise in the course of this whiteboard that also might teach us complexity, learning by doing, learning by participating. Well, the main thing that always comes out to me from a complexity perspective with these interacting or improvising systems is that the final state of the system, the final state of the whiteboard, the final state of the conversation, the text channel, it's never where the individual people would have gone alone. It simply is impossible for someone to generate art that's this beautiful. And it's the kind of construction where, independent of language, independent of whether it was formulas or whether it was all symbols, all emojis, people look at that and they say, people made that. Multiple people made that. And you can also see a thing or two about how people are feeding back and drawing a little heart. And so really it just looking at something that multiple ants made or multiple neurons made or multiple people made, I think it's the system that did this, and that's the meaningful part.
Thank you for sharing that. And as you're sharing it, I'm seeing additional hearts. They are taking your feedback right on. Thank you. Love the heart right back at all of you. Yes, great to see that. And as we do that, we have a few more questions. So if you want to finish your train of thoughts, you may do so. But I'm going to now continue to move on to the next slide because I have another question for you, which is, because of COVID-19, what are new things that you've gotten to be curious about? So the statement that I put here on the note is that because of COVID-19, I am curious to learn more about ... So I'm going to start here first to ask, our group of friends here, Sean, for you, what was something new that you became more curious because of COVID-19?
Our supply chains. Just how it is amazing to me how many businesses were so over leveraged that a couple of months of not having the right level of income, they just tank and explode. So it's amazing to me how I guess I don't know what to call it, society just got so comfortable with the way things were that they're just yeah, it's fine, it's no problem, we can all be over leveraged, we can have these amazingly intricate supply chains that go back and forth again, and that's fine, and people can be traveling at insane levels of all mixing all across with flights everywhere with no repercussions at all. Now I think we're reevaluating a lot of these base assumptions of society now. So for me, I guess because of COVID-19, I'm curious to learn more about what new normal are we going to build together that is probably going to have baked in a little better sustainability, a little better local sourcing. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's not going to go back to the same, and we're going to move forward in some direction. That's what I'm excited about.
Awesome. No, thank you for sharing that. And as soon as you said it, I've started seeing a handful of folks sharing that, system, networks, global supply chain. And, even for myself, as somebody who does do professional development and work usually in B2B setting, a supply chain was an immediate hit, both as an individual where, I'm not traveling. So, that kind of, business work is different. But, I'm part of the supply chain in the business part of the world. And to hear with my procurement friends and how they have to reprioritize, rethink about what they do in every single decision and how that's having a both macro and micro effect. And one of the things that I was always intrigued about when I got into more of the business landscape than before when I was in government and policymaking was that, every individual actually make decision that has a long-term ripple effect. And I think that's something that when I used to be an employee, I didn't really understand. I thought that, that's only the big bosses that do. That's only until you're at a certain stage of life. But when I started my business, I realized it's not true. As you supply chain, actually, everyone's a consumer. Everyone goes to certain restaurants. And, to know that if a company, when a big company usually buys a lot of things, when they stop doing that, it's actually impacting directly business owners. Direct business owners means consumers not having access to things, as you said. And so it reframes the mind of thinking. And I'm seeing a lot of other patterns, a lot of network comments on that. JP, curious to hear from you. What pattern is most intriguing for you to see when you're seeing this whiteboard right now?
Truthfully, I'm actually liking the lock-in we're getting, or we're getting some what's known as signal boosting or bumping up. I'm seeing these hearts, and I'm curious to know whether those are the original creators or whether these are people. And it seems to me these are people kind of going in and going yeah, that's a great idea, and building on top of that. So you're getting your first layer. You have your substrate, which is your space, and then it's people decided Post-it notes were a good medium, right? And then they started to draw around the Post-it notes. So you have this multiple layering up, and it's this community consensus that's really cool. It's just kind of coming along, without any kind of instruction. So that's complexity, right? That's
absolutely.
I mean,
emergent order.
Yeah.
Someone's curious about antibodies, someone else is curious about dinner. That's complexity.
And it connects back to being a global pandemic. So let's continue on. Finish your thoughts if you would like to. I'm going to move on to the next question because I want to continue to build this and thinking about, again, we started our conversation here, even thinking about at the end of the day, to go back to simplicity is reframing our minds, being open to understanding how things are different and changing our thinking. So the question I have for you now this time is, because of COVID-19, I had to change the way I think about X. So slightly different. Yes, now you were curious about certain things, but I'm pretty sure there were certain things you really had to change the way you think about something, whether it was something that you took for granted. Oh, yes, I think we're seeing immediately the first one, the law. Thank you. Dan, I'm curious, what are some thoughts that comes to mind when you hear this question, even for you? What are things that you probably had to change the way you think about something?
Just to give one example of many, when we were organizing this conference, and while we were having this complexity-informed discussion about consequences and nonlinear effects of different types of policies, we were also doing a little nano-organizational question, which is, how do we put on this event that's so important to us? Do we delay, or is it more important that, you know, hell or high water, we really made it happen for the community? And as we basically leaned into making it happen online, and we saw more and more people making this do or die decision between delay, when, who knows? No one can know. Just, it's not for anyone to know. Or are we going to do it online? And then when we decided to do it online, it moved from, okay, well, you know, we could do it from San Francisco, or we could go in this other neighborhood. It's easier to get through this public transportation to here, but this public transportation is easier here. And then it's like, no, we can do it online and we can make it free. And so we hope that sort of a rethinking moment, people can really ask the fundamental questions about who's being accessible at this conference. You know, who's really being a part of the discussion, who's putting their notes down, who's getting to make sure that their voice is heard. And it just totally opened up new vistas for our group, but also for me personally through that.
Thank you for sharing that as a real case example, guys. You just heard the confirmation. In a way, you know, everything has a silver lining. Yes, this is a horrible time being for a lot of people in the world, but thank you all for being present, being here, active, and joining us later live and rewatching this to really take ourselves to think about, how do we make this a learning moment since it's happening anyway? How do we make sure we stay curious? And how do we make sure we change the way we think about things and take that into action? And so they could have thought about it, and this event, we would not be hanging out here. How sad is that, right? You would all not be hanging out here, or we would have never met. And that's an opportunity lost. And so I hope you all know we all have actions that we can take every single day and connecting to that. And so going back to the map here, I see a lot of comments about parents, relationship on health. I know within our group, we have somebody we can perhaps ask who are parents. Could I circle back to Sean on this question?
Me? It is difficult. It is really hard. Our schools are so important, not just to teach our kids, but also like to allow parents to work and like function. And that has been, you know, it's been tricky, but it's been a learning experience. And I think I wanted to kind of circle back to like why, you know, COVID's the theme. Obviously it's like everywhere right now and it's impacting everything, but it's like the perfect example problem that shows you why you need to use like complexity thinking. Because parenting, for instance, there's not one discipline that's going to tell you the right answer for like, how I improve parenting this way. It's like, it factors in like your, if someone's getting, you know, is sick now, like medicine in that field and making sure they're taken care of, but also economics and making sure everyone has a job in the family household and like that your house is actually fine, you're making enough money. But then there's also like your nearest, your neighborhoods, and like, it's just like the supply chains like we were talking about before, all the businesses and supply chains are kind of changing, that you're changing now your decision as a family about where you can go and get supplies. Are we out of meat now? Like all these things are influencing, all the different disciplines are influencing each other in this kind of one crisis that's affecting all these different systems. And so it really is the perfect theme for us all to think about this weekend, to try to dig into some cluster of those connections and untangle them a bit and nudge the system with a leverage point, like which we'll talk about, you know, in terms of Denali Meadows, like leverage points and changing systems, nonlinear effects you can have on systems. But we need to find where those are and untangle them a bit. And yeah, anyway, that is off on a tangent, but that's basically where I went with it.
But it's a true reflection, and thank you very much for sharing that. You know, I'm seeing more comments on that same thread, work-life boundaries. Everything, thank you, somebody, thank you, shout out, you're absolutely right, everything. How I choose my circle, and that includes, you know, and low income, yes, absolutely, thank you for highlighting that, low income workers and families dealing with uncertainty. Because on top of everything that we just heard, if we're in inequality state, if we're in a situation, I mean, I was having catch-up phone calls with some of my friends who were on theater work, and they realized for the first time who had Wi-Fi access or not. Guys, I know all of us are having access so that we can have this conversation, but there's also a lot of people who don't. And so I'm really excited that this weekend we are diving a little bit deeper. We're not trying to think about just one demographic, one age group, and all of you are joining in globally to talk about this. And so how do we be more mindful so that we don't lose sight of that and honor all these differences, even if it feels complex and we feel like we don't know it, it feels big, but one step at a time. As you have all beautifully shared. Oh, I love this. Okay, let's now go to the next question. I hope you're all enjoying this. I am loving the thread. So because I'm all about problem solving, let's continue to talk on now on the next iteration, which is to solve complex problem, we need more cross collaboration, which I think has been reflective in just thinking about the type of problems we want to solve. But I want to hear more specific examples, right? So cross collaboration in where? Like, what kind of cross collaboration do you think we really actually need? Because there's probably some priorities. There's probably some type of solutions that we might want to see more. And there's particular kinds that you might want to focus this weekend, as well as determining who you want to work with. Yes, world is absolutely one place we want more cross collaboration, but let me start having some conversation here in our group. So, JP, I want to circle back to you. What could you share maybe an example of a cross collaboration that is effective, that was different?
One of the one that's accessible off the top of my head is we had a so this was at the Santa Fe Institute's Complex Systems Summer School. And we had a doctor of cardiology, or cardiology specialist, cardiac specialist, and a mathematician who specialized in chaos theory. And it was really neat because they came together. He had a bunch of EKG data, and the mathematician, using his tool set, was able just to kind of whip up something pretty quickly to basically pull out chaotic variations in patients susceptible to cardiac events or heart attacks, basically. And to me, like something like that synthesis that came together so quickly was a really, really inspiring moment for me, because the doctor could then take that forward and actually apply that for a new diagnostic test. Those things take a lot of years, but that's how the science progressed. And it was like this minute or this second when we saw the next frontier of, or the next boundary or the next like leap of the field kind of take shape. So sometimes it's as simple as that. Not that that's always the case, but it's when you have people asking the right questions come together with people with the right tools. I think that's really inspiring. So I don't know if that exactly addressed what you're looking for, but
it absolutely did.
Yeah.
JP, thank you for sharing that, because what I hope you're all hearing is an example is that there's actually a lot if we look and take a moment to pause and really reflect. I know, for instance, one of the things that was hugely humbling working in government and nuclear security is that, when I left and got into the business world, there's a lot of research that shows, like, guys, actually a lot of the basic technology and tools, somebody from the government actually gave a grant at one point, and then it got approval, and then it became massively available. Like, there had to be some kind of public-private partnership for us to have some kind of accessibility. And whether that's in health, as we just heard from the example from JP as shared, and from different audiences, it's so hugely important. And I think cross collaboration, it's not just across industries, it could be also across different age groups, different demographics, right, different communities. And we're seeing already quite different patterns. Dan, I'm also curious to hear from your side. Are we seeing any question maybe from the Keybase that we're missing out on by chance? I want to make sure if we have any chats going on there. And for the time being, let me try to see creative spaces, tech, thinking, staying and doing, absolutely right, local, resilient communities. Dan, checking in with you. What are some other thoughts that come to mind for you?
Yeah, people are pretty much interacting on the whiteboard only for now, which is great. They're in the jitsies, hopefully seeing each other, having some fun, hopefully not listening to us, just looking at the whiteboard and talking it out. But one way I would kind of look at this whiteboard from a complexity perspective is we're in the storming phase. And eventually, there comes a day after the night of fun where you want to look at the whiteboard and think about, well, what are the dimensions? Country is a dimension, age is a dimension, educational level or internet accessibility, socioeconomic status, every dimension. Just let's lay them out and let's see how we can make these solutions that are previous ways of thinking about the issue so that we can make a difference across these different areas. Because this definitely is not just a hackathon for the participants, by the participants, and only for them. It's really something where we want to have an impact that goes beyond. And the first step, and hopefully a big first step on the way, is to meet the right collaborators and to make sure that your design and your system for coming to the right project is integrated with complexity thinking just from the very beginning.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to re-emphasize, find good people. I cannot make that clear. And find good people, parentheses, find people that you usually do not ever talk to. Find people who is not in your domain of expertise. Go join a group that you might feel like, you know what, I'm not really sure how it can bring value, but I just know that this group knows a lot of things that I don't know. I might have a different perspective. That might be the place where you find new synergy, because as we already talked about, if we want to explore cross collaboration, we want to figure out how to solve complex problems better together. We cannot do this by staying in the same silo or a continuing perspective. And so, yes, Dan.
Yeah, I raised my hand. I have one more point to make, just to really emphasize how everybody across the experience spectrum contributes to every phase of the team's function. The person who's the superstar for the team is the person who makes function at the highest possible level. And a lot of times what that requires isn't some superhuman effort. It's the right question and the right perspective and the right criticism and the right extension or the right generalization. And that's truly something that everyone can access and contribute to teams with, because it's literally what you're about. So whatever it is that you're about, if it's in the context of any team and we're trying to make a space where it's accepted and valued and where we build on that, this is hopefully a space where you'll feel welcome to make those contributions, because you know that they're going to be received in the right area. So to the beginners and to the most experienced among us, let's try to keep that in mind and just remember these awesome community principles, because there's so much that we can get done together.
Thank you for reminding us those golden nuggets. I mean, please make sure that, the beautiful thing of us even doing this on the whiteboard is so that we can go back and to remember all these aspects. And so thank you for reminding us where we all build the perspective. And so to build on all of that, I want to continue to build on all your angles, opinions, perspective, because this whiteboard is already filling up and we want to continue to learn from all of you. Oh, we have already early birds getting over there. So the next question that I wanted to ask is then to, Dan, I'm so glad you said it, because the next question I was going to ask is then how can we stay curious and open-minded as we solve complex problems? Because I kind of knew we were going to get to that direction, because it's so easy to get back to where I'm comfortable. Oh, this is how I usually work. This is what I'm used to. But that's not how we're going to solve complex problem. But I think it's helpful to kind of at least put it out there to say, okay, then how can we stay courageous and curious? At least one tip of advice that I always usually share is that start with something small. If somebody said something or something was shared, could you think from the of like, oh, I wonder why? I noticed. And those two phrases actually triggers your brain of thinking. Instead of being reactive, it puts you in a curious state of mind even without you realizing. So I noticed, I wonder. Those are two phrases that I recommend thinking about that helps you to stay more curious. But when I circle back, Sean, what about you? What helps you stay curious and be open-minded when you solve complex problems?
I guess it always, whenever I would want to solve a problem that is a complex problem, like I feel like there's something that philosophers call like negative capability, or it's basically like you go in with the least amount of bias possible and you just let the truth kind of come to you. And I think a lot of the times if you're going to develop like you're trying to stop this virus, for instance, right? You're super narrow focus on like the actual virology. it could actually be a sociological solution that does way better than anything you could have done in the silo of like virology, trying to stop the spread of a virus and stuff like that. And I think if you have to go in with this beginner's mindset that I will see what the problem brings to me, or what I'm a data scientist by trade. So like what the data tells me is kind of what we say in that field, like let the data speak, and then I will like, figure out my model and all that stuff after the data is going to talk to me. But if you don't do that, it's so easy to go down a path that is closed off from the reality that your model should be taken into account if you really wanted to capture the real world behavior or affect the real world system. So to me, it's not so much like I always do it, I guess. Like I never don't, because your solutions can be so easily wrong if you don't go in with a beginner's mindset and think you're an expert in a particular domain, and you see the world as, a bunch of nails and you have that one hammer to hit it with. The world doesn't work that way so much anymore, and it's getting even more connected, and things are mixing even more. That mindset's going to kind of go extinct to some degree. I mean, there's always going to be specialties, but now those specialties are nodes that are connected to other specialty nodes.
No, thank you for sharing that. And it ties very beautifully. I'm looking at these comments here, and there's a lot of words that says listen, humility, clearing, defining our own boundaries. And I would say that's also connecting back to self-awareness, being able to be a better communicator. But I think active listening is one skill, at least even for me. I've been doing a lot more and better during this COVID-19 time, because, as Sean, you have acknowledged that how often do we come to a room? You probably, all of you probably, even when you came to this event, you probably had some form of expectation. We always do when we come to any event, any kind of commitment or anything that we want to do. How often does that expectation of what we think success looks like limit what we can experience? Yes, I emphasis on that. And so I want to circle back to JP, because, JP, when we started at the very beginning, a few hours ago, you said so many thoughtful, clear kind of thoughts in how we should think about the experience. And one of the words that I wrote down was the exploratory mindset, and how we explore a little bit more. Could you share a little bit more on how we can listen better and look out and be better observers throughout this experience?
I think this is my own personal philosophy at this point, but I've always approached complexity science as the humble science, or not the humble science, but a humble way of practicing science, where one of the words that was put up, or phrases that was put up, was, nobody's an expert in complexity, which kind of serves to pull the reins back a little bit on a lot of what traditional science and engineering is about. So I think that's why it's a helpful way of couching questions, and a helpful way of couching exploration, to understand that there's no definite answer, and a lot of the things that we put forward are best first pass approximations, best first pass attempts, and it's an iterative process always. So that, keeping that in mind, top to bottom, if you will, so it allows for the formation of creative answers, let's say, which may or may not go anywhere. And not to say failure is okay. Failure is okay if that's the word you want to use, but it's more or less, creative ideas, not, you throw 10 things on the wall and one of them sticks and is viable, and then you go forward from that, right? So that's the threshold condition, and then the upper condition is it allows you to be flexible with your response as well, or your deployment of ideas, because it says, well, we have this really good thing, we'll see how it tests against the real world, we'll see how it's reacted to and responded to, and then we'll iterate from there again. And unfortunately, getting into the policy realm of things is a little bit more difficult, because you have to be definitely sure. But for sure, on the science side and the development of these things, I think that I see, humility's on there. Humbleness, humility is a good top to bottom approach, and also helpful again, to kind of counter the prevailing 300 years of scientific thought, as we talk about complexity as a new paradigm, right? So.
Thank you for sharing that. And, real, as you said, it really echoes. And if I may add, I'm going to selfishly say, I love the comment that says meetings like this. I agree as well. And, we got even pictures. To comment back to JP, I'm going to, appreciate your comment. One of the things that you've just highlighted is the iterative process. And, if I can share the team, if it's okay, in full transparency, we went through many iterations and how this experience was going to look like. I can tell you, I think we're at version, to be honest, I had, since even our ideation, I kind of had to think through a few more. So this is probably version 7. I am glad we did not stick to that version 1 when we first talked, because this is so much better. And I hope you're all enjoying it, because, hey, we're not going to be walking the talk if we stopped in iteration 1 and we're asking you to go to iteration 10. So no, we had to go through iteration 7 and 10 because we want to walk our talk to create this space together. So with that, I think it's time. Let's continue to go to our next question.
I think, Dan, you wanted to speak? I saw your hand up.
Yes, please, Dan. Sorry.
It's so true what you said about the iteration, and it's like you don't need the script in the moment, but it's so helpful to have prepared it and to have gotten everybody's feedback on it, to kind of have thought through some of the things that could have gone wrong. Now, it ended up being a totally different set of things that went wrong. So at least we tried. But we were ready to solve the problem. We knew that we were going to take a flexible mindset. And now how do we go from solving live stream and lag to solving these things that every day we need to be focused on? And it does have a fun element. It has a comedic element. And it also has this reaching out element, because if it didn't have those, then we simply couldn't be able to carry on in the long march against whatever it is that complexity is marching towards.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I said, I kept saying, if we're not having fun, why are we even doing this? Yes, difficult problems need to be solved, but why can't we take a positive attitude and have fun with it? Which I'm seeing already from the folks. Thank you all. Oh, you guys are already on your A game of going ahead. How will you make this weekend intentional and meaningful? I'm already seeing dozens of post-its. Kindness, thank you. Explore, listen better. Speak from the heart. Yes, absolutely. We've already got a lot of hearts from the get-go. So yes, yes, yes. Curiosity, learn, intentionally connect. Absolutely right word choice in front of connect. We don't want just spammy connects. No. Ask questions, which we're doing here. We're asking you tons of questions, and try something new. I'll add my other transparent note. I have not used Jamboard before. This is my first time, and now I am going to use it for a lot of the other things, because you guys have proven how it could look like. My version that I had in my head, I can just tell you the version that is happening right now is just 10 times better than what I even thought it was going to be. So thank you for already making this meaningful and intentional together. So I'm going to continue on, because I want to just highlight 2 particular points. I already see some other things. I guess folks have already gone ahead and created some other groups. Oh, I love that. But kind of want to sit on this before I kind of scroll back, is that complex, simplicity, whatever the words, whatever the terminology, whatever the frame of thinking you're coming into, I thought these 2 quotes kind of really might help us stay grounded in thinking about how we navigate this time, which is right. As Stephen Hawking said, I think the next century will be the center of complexity. I need to look up specifically when he actually said it, but we are indeed living in that time. But then also the Confucius quote, just thinking about life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. And I want to go back, because, JP, you kind of didn't know where I was going, but you kind of already said that at the very beginning. If you remember way back when we started this conversation, you said how important it was and how surprising it was to recognize the inner child, that we actually used to be really good at it. And I think simple things I think about is, looking at little kids, they don't, there's no poker face. Or at least there's some who are, admit, but most of them are, they like it, I like it, they don't like it, I don't like it. It's pretty simple. And sometimes I think as we grew up, we kind of overcomplicated things. Oh, well, I'm not supposed to express that I like it or not because that's going to be too impolite. I'm not supposed to express that this is going to be at, no, that's not going to be, we got to do the pull and tag thing. Yeah. Okay, no, we got to add 3 more procedures on this thing. And no, that's too easy. So we got to make sure we add 4 data points. Oh, I don't think we have enough information. So we should, you see where I'm heading. And so, yes, we are living in a complex time period, but maybe we can simplify a little bit. And I hope this weekend we get to explore a mix of all of that and think about what it means for all of you. And so I want to circle back to each one of our other organizers to check in and ask briefly, what are final thoughts of wisdom and maybe thoughts you want to share. So Sean, if I can start with you.
I don't know. I guess it's, just that beginner's mindset is really any problem that you end up picking for the weekend, just pretend you've never heard of any of the words before and just go completely from scratch and see what, through the interactions with people in your work group tomorrow, that's gonna be totally randomized. So it's just a total mix of awesome perspectives. Just try to redefine a lot of these concepts and words and systems that you think you know a ton about already. Because odds are you're in a silo and you have not seen the full breadth of the reality of that system that you are hoping to change, right? So that's kind of a prerequisite if you're really going to do a good job for a positive change.
Thank you. JP?
I'm beyond excited to see what people come up with. And it's always, thanks very much, Monica. This was actually a really exciting activity. Like, I didn't know it was going to come out of this, but just seeing what develops when you put a substrate down, that is what's thrilling, inspirational, exciting, curious, all those positive emotions that can come to the forefront. So I'm just thrilled. I'm just happy to be here. I'm thrilled to know that so many people from really around the world in short notice joined us. So to do meaningful and important work, applying the things that I think are important, and that so many people join us, and the drop of a hat, basically. Like, let's go out there and let's change the world. So.
Thank you. And Dan?
Wow, that it's only been 4 hours since we took off. I think there's so much ahead. And really, I would just, on this first night, remark that there was only so much time for words to be dispensed, only so many speakers who we could really hear from in depth. And the rest of the weekend and moving forward using Keybase as our backend, that's really where we're going to unpack and explore. So it's not just about the organizers saying that it's a community. It's really about what the community does. So in service of that, just at any point during the weekend or beyond, really let us know how we can help you catalyze complexity, how we can help you serve, or some other combination of those words. It's really what we're about, and we want to make it happen. So please, we look forward to working with you and also to what happens together. So thanks, Monica. Really an awesome live stream. Some of the most fun that I've had in complexity as well.
Thank you. And I was going to say yes and to everything. Have fun is going to be my added point to all of this, because, hey, I get it. We've all been staring enough of our screens. We're asking you to spend extra hours on doing that. I'm going to be honest, that is going to be a little toll for some folks when they're like, I thought my weekend was going to be screen free. Well, you're still in for a treat. And I hope that these past few hours was just a small reflection of what more is to come. But as you have heard many times, don't come with your own agenda, because that might limit what you actually experience. Like, come with openness, bring some thoughts. I mean, hey, if you're like me, type A, you can still do things like this. I'm going to say, for instance, my goal is to still talk to 5 different people. Start something like that. That could be a start. But with that being said, thank you all very much. I'm going to be here for the rest of the weekend as well to continue to dive in, challenge you, and, break things apart too, because, I like macro and micro. So, Dan, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. That was awesome.
I'm just going to end the live stream right now. So thanks so much for joining. Everybody else, you can stay on the call for just a few more seconds. But thanks, everyone, for watching. And you'll hear a